Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The house breathed differently after I found them. I'd lived in the inherited Victorian for 3 years without once venturing into the cramped attic space above my bedroom. The ladder rungs felt brittle beneath my weight that October afternoon, dust motes dancing in the amber light filtering through a single grimy window. What drew me up there wasn't curiosity but necessity. A water stain had appeared on my ceiling, spreading like a dark thought across the white paint. Among the cobwebs and forgotten Christmas decorations, I discovered them. 2 brass rods, tarnished but elegant, lying parallel in a velvet-lined box that seemed far too pristine for its surroundings. The moment my fingers touched the metal, a chill ran through my palms that had nothing to do with the October air seeping through the roof. I'd heard of dowsing rods, of course. Water witching, they called it in rural areas. But I was a software engineer, a man of algorithms and logic trees. The idea that bent copper could divine anything beyond electromagnetic interference struck me as absurd. Yet something compelled me to carry them downstairs, their weight surprisingly substantial in my hands. That evening, alone in my living room with a glass of wine growing warm on the coffee table, I held the rods loosely as I'd seen in old movies. The house settled around me with its familiar symphony of creaks and sighs, the heating system cycling on with a low rumble that seemed to originate from somewhere deeper than the basement. The rods moved. Not dramatically. No Hollywood theatrics or supernatural fireworks. Just a slow, deliberate convergence, as if drawn by invisible magnetism toward the far wall where my grandmother's armoire stood sentinel. I told myself it was my subconscious muscle movements, the ideomotor effect that explains Ouija boards and other parlor tricks, but as I walked toward the massive piece of furniture, the rods grew more insistent, crossing and recrossing until they pointed directly at the space behind it. The armoire hadn't been moved in decades. Dust had settled into the grooves where its base met the hardwood floor, creating a perfect seal that spoke of permanence. But when I pressed my shoulder against its side and pushed, it shifted with surprising ease, as if it had been waiting for this moment. Behind it, the wallpaper was different. Older, a faded pattern of roses that clashed with the burgundy stripes I remembered from childhood visits. More importantly, there was a gap in the baseboard, barely visible but unmistakable once I knew to look for it. My fingers found the hidden catch almost instinctively, and a section of the wall swung inward on silent hinges. The safe was small, built into the wall cavity like a mouth frozen in a perpetual scream. Its brass dial gleamed despite years of concealment, and when I spun it experimentally, the mechanism moved with the smooth precision of a Swiss watch. But it was locked, of course, its secret sealed behind steel and time. I photographed the serial number and manufacturer's mark with my phone, then spent the next 2 hours online hunting for default combinations, factory settings, anything that might grant me access. The model was from the 1940s, produced by a company that had long since vanished into corporate mergers and historical footnotes. But I found what I needed in a collector's forum. These particular safes often came with a standard combination that many owners never bothered to change. My hands trembled as I dialed the sequence. Left to 10, right to 25, left to 16. The tumbler's final click echoed through the room like a door closing somewhere in the distance. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a ribbon that had once been white, were the letters. Dozens of them. Each envelope addressed in my mother's careful script to someone named Rebecca Chen Martinez. The return address was our family home, but the dates spanned 15 years, from my birth until just 2 years before my mother's death. I knew that name, Rebecca Chen Martinez. The memory surfaced slowly, like something rising from deep water. I was 8, maybe 9, standing in the kitchen while my mother spoke in hushed, urgent tones on the phone. When I asked who she was talking to, her face had gone pale, and she'd told me firmly that some conversations were not for children. But I'd heard the name, had asked about it later. My mother had been adamant. She had no other children, had never had any other children, would never speak of this again. Yet here was evidence to the contrary, carefully preserved and hidden away like a shameful secret. The first letter was brief, formal, the handwriting younger, but unmistakably my mother's. It spoke of apologies and explanations, of mistakes made and opportunities lost. But as I read deeper into the chronology, the tone shifted. The letters became longer, more intimate, filled with details about my childhood, my achievements, my struggles. My mother had been telling this Rebecca about me for years, sharing the story of the son she'd kept while writing to the daughter she'd given away. By the time I reached the final letter, dated just months before my mother's stroke, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the paper. In it, my mother wrote about her growing illness, her fear that she would die before making things right. She promised to leave clues, to ensure that Rebecca and I would find each other eventually. She mentioned the safe, the location, even the dowsing rod she'd placed in the attic as a sort of mystical breadcrumb trail. But it was the last paragraph that sent ice through my veins. He doesn't know about you yet, but he will. When the time comes, when the house calls to him, he'll understand. You'll both understand. The passage between our worlds has always been thin here. I've felt you watching, Rebecca. I've heard you calling. Soon, you'll be able to answer. I read those words 3 times before their implication truly sank in. Watching. Calling. The passage between worlds. That night, I left the letters spread across my kitchen table and tried to sleep, but the house wouldn't let me. Every settling timber sounded like footsteps, every gust of wind through the eaves like whispered conversations. Around 3 in the morning, I heard it for the first time, a voice thin and metallic, echoing through the plumbing like sound, traveling through tin cans connected by string. Passage. The word seemed to bounce through the walls, traveling from the kitchen pipes to the bathroom, then down to the basement and back up through the heating ducts. I lay in bed, muscles rigid, telling myself it was the water heater, the expansion and contraction of metal, anything but what my rational mind refused to accept. The next night, it happened again, and the night after that. Always the same word, always the same metallic timbre, as if someone were speaking directly into the plumbing system. During the day, I threw myself into research, scouring online databases for any record of Rebecca Chen Martinez. I found traces, a birth certificate that matched the time frame, adoption records that had been sealed, a paper trail that led nowhere and everywhere at once. But it was the photographs that finally broke me. I found them in an old newspaper archive, a society page from 15 years ago featuring local college graduates. There she was, Rebecca Chen Martinez, accepting some academic award. The resemblance was undeniable, the same dark hair I'd inherited from our mother, the same sharp jawline, even the same slightly asymmetrical smile that had always made me self-conscious in photographs. She existed, she was real. And according to the accompanying article, she died in a car accident 3 days after the photo was taken. The voice in the pipes grew stronger after that discovery. No longer content with single words, it began to form sentences, messages that seemed directed specifically at me. It told me things about my childhood that only family would know, recalled conversations I'd had with my mother in this very house. But the voice was wrong somehow, distorted not just by its metallic medium but by something else, an otherworldly quality that made my skin crawl. By the end of the week, I could feel her presence everywhere. In the corners of my vision, I caught glimpses of movement that vanished when I turned to look. The temperature in certain rooms dropped without explanation, and more than once I found myself speaking aloud to the empty air, responding to a presence I couldn't see, but could no longer deny. The rational part of my mind, the engineer who dealt in concrete realities and measurable phenomena, insisted this was grief. Delayed mourning for the mother I'd lost, guilt over the sister I'd never known existed, isolation and stress manifesting as auditory hallucinations. But another part, a deeper part that had perhaps always known something was missing from my family's story, recognized the truth in those metallic whispers. She was here. She had always been here, watching from whatever space separated the living from the dead, waiting for someone to open the right door. The safe remained open on my kitchen counter, its contents now spread across every available surface. Birth certificates and death certificates, adoption papers and school records, a paper reconstruction of a life that had run parallel to mine for 32 years. But among Rebecca's documents, I found something that changed everything. A letter addressed to me, written in her handwriting but dated the day after her death. The envelope was warm to the touch, as if it had been sitting in sunlight despite the gray October sky outside. Inside, her message was brief, but devastating. "I've been waiting so long to meet you, brother. Mother promised we'd find each other, but she never mentioned it would be like this." The passage she spoke of, it's not a metaphor. It's real, and it's here in the house. Every night, I stand outside the boundaries of your world and call to you. Every night you hear me getting closer. Soon you'll have to decide, will you let me in? That's when I noticed the temperature. The entire house had grown cold, not the gradual chill of autumn, but the sudden bone-deep cold of winter air rushing through an open door. My breath began to fog, and the kitchen windows started to frost over despite the moderate evening weather outside. The voice in the pipes was louder now, no longer distant and metallic, but close, intimate, as if someone were standing directly beside me whispering in my ear. It spoke my name, told me stories about the childhood we should have shared, described the room she would have had if our mother had been brave enough to keep us both. I realized I was no longer alone in the house. I had not been alone for days. She was here, in the spaces between walls, in the gaps between heartbeats, in the passage that connected her world to mine. The dowsing rods had found more than a hidden safe. They'd found a doorway that my mother had somehow opened and never quite managed to close. Now, as I write this, I can hear her more clearly than ever. She stands behind me as I type, reading over my shoulder, occasionally correcting my grammar with a sisterly fondness that should be comforting, but instead fills me with inexplicable dread. The house has become a liminal space, neither fully mine nor fully hers, a passage between states of existence that grows thinner with each passing hour. Tomorrow, I will have to choose. I can feel the decision approaching like an inevitable conclusion to an equation I've been solving my entire life. The safe door remains open, its contents scattered across my kitchen like pieces of a puzzle I'm only now beginning to understand. But there's something else inside now, something that wasn't there before. A photograph that shouldn't exist, showing Rebecca and me as children, standing together in this very house, smiling at a camera that was never there. In the photograph, we cast only one shadow. The voice whispers my name again, patient and persistent, and utterly, terrifyingly real. "She's been waiting so long to come home," she says, "waiting for someone to complete the passage that will finally reunite our fractured family. But I'm beginning to understand that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. And some families are meant to remain divided by more than just death. The choice is mine. The passage is open. I just don't know anymore which side of it I'm supposed to be on." Story 2. The realtor never mentioned the smell. When I first drove up the winding dirt road to the cabin, eucalyptus trees swaying in the highland breeze of San Joaquin, I thought I'd found the perfect retirement refuge. 43 years of geological surveys, mineral assessments, and corporate boardrooms had left me craving silence. The little wooden structure perched on what the paperwork called reclaimed agricultural land seemed ideal, isolated enough for solitude, close enough to town for supplies. The smell hit me the moment I stepped out of my truck that first evening in March. Not unpleasant exactly, but persistent. Rich, loamy earth with an undertone of char, as if someone had been burning peat nearby. I assumed it was seasonal, maybe farmers preparing fields. The mountains around San Joaquin were known for their unique soil composition after all. That night, I built my first fire in the stone hearth. The flames caught eagerly, crackling with the sweet scent of eucalyptus logs I'd bought in town. I fell asleep in my reading chair to the sound of wind through timber and the comfortable weight of exhaustion from unpacking. I woke to cold darkness and the acrid smell of burnt earth, stronger now, seeping through the floorboards like ground fog. The fire had died completely. Not even embers remained. Strange, considering I'd loaded it well before dozing off. But I was tired, probably hadn't banked it properly. City habits die hard. The second night, I was more careful. I built the fire methodically, the way my father had taught me during our camping trips decades ago. Tinder, kindling, carefully arranged logs with enough airflow to sustain the burn. I even set my phone alarm for 3 a.m. to add more wood. The alarm never went off. I woke naturally just before dawn to find the hearthstone cold, filled with ash so fine it looked almost powdery. The smell was stronger, rising from the floor itself now, and for the first time, I noticed something else. The house felt different at night, as if it were settling in ways that defied physics. Tiny creaks and sighs that seemed to come from below rather than above. By the fourth night, I was convinced something was wrong with the chimney. But my inspection revealed no obvious problems, no blockages, no damaged flue liner, no signs of downdraft issues. The firebox looked normal, the damper operated smoothly, yet every morning brought the same result: dead ashes and that persistent smell of burnt earth. I called the previous owner, reached him at a retirement home in Florianopolis. His voice carried a strange hesitation when I mentioned the heating issues. "The fire goes out," he said slowly, as if testing the words. "Yes, it always did that. We used electric heaters mostly, cheaper than constantly rebuilding fires. But electric heat was expensive, and I'd bought this place partly to live simply. There had to be a logical explanation. I was a geologist, trained to find rational causes for natural phenomena. Mysterious self-extinguishing fires belonged in campfire stories, not in my retirement. The breakthrough came when I decided to dig a well. The town water was clean but heavily chlorinated, and I missed the pure taste of groundwater. Besides, the physical work would be good for me, and I was curious about the local geology. I chose a spot 30 yards from the cabin, where the land seemed most stable. The first few feet revealed typical highland soil, dark, rich humus, with good drainage. But at about 4 feet down, my shovel struck something unexpected. A layer of what looked like charcoal briquettes, but irregular in shape and oddly dense. Peat. Carbonized peat. I should have recognized it immediately, but the formation was unusual. Peat bogs required specific conditions: acidic water, low oxygen, consistent moisture. This highland terrain was all wrong for peat formation, yet here it was, a thick layer of the stuff, burned black as coal. I extracted several chunks for examination. Under my hand lens, they showed the classic compressed plant matter structure of peat, but with an odd crystalline quality I'd never seen before. More intriguing were the impressions pressed into the softer sections, clear indentations that looked remarkably like footprints. Human footprints. The scale was wrong, though, too small for adult feet, but the stride pattern suggested bipedal locomotion. I told myself they were just chance formations, the random impressions that nature creates when organic matter compresses over time. But they were detailed enough to show individual toe marks, heel strikes, even what appeared to be pressure ridges along the ball of each foot. I photographed everything methodically, documenting the depth, orientation, and characteristics of each impression. 12 distinct prints in the first piece alone, all seeming to move in the same direction, toward my cabin. That night, the smell was overwhelming. It rose through the floorboards like a living thing, thick enough to taste. I opened every window despite the cold, but the odor only grew stronger. For the first time since moving in, I felt genuinely uneasy. The house around me creaked and whispered with sounds I couldn't identify, and twice I could have sworn I heard something moving beneath the floor. I spent the following day expanding the excavation, driven by a combination of scientific curiosity and growing unease. The peat layer extended at least 20 feet in every direction, riddled with more of those impossible footprints. Some appeared fresh, the impressions sharp and well-defined. Others looked ancient, worn smooth by time and pressure. The strangest discovery came when I photographed the same section I'd documented the day before. The prints had moved. Not dramatically, a shift of perhaps an inch or two, but unmistakably different from my previous photos. The heel impression of one print had deepened, while the toe marks of another had become more pronounced. It was as if whatever had made them was still walking, still pressing deeper into the earth. I told myself it was ground settling, moisture changes, natural compression. Peat was notoriously unstable after all. But when I knelt to examine the prints more closely, I felt warmth radiating from the carbonized blocks, and the smell of burnt earth was so strong it made my eyes water. That evening I couldn't bring myself to build a fire. Instead I sat in the cold cabin, electric space heater humming, studying my photographs by lamplight. The progression was undeniable. The prints were changing, shifting position day by day. More disturbing was the pattern I was beginning to see. They all led toward the exact spot where my cabin sat. I called the County Geological Survey office the next morning, spoke to a young technician who sounded bored until I mentioned the peat formation. "You sure it's peat?" she asked, suddenly alert. That whole area was surveyed in the 80s, no peat deposits on record. But I knew peat when I saw it. 43 years in geology had taught me to trust my eyes. I described the formations, the apparent age, the unusual crystalline structure. "Sir," she said carefully, "that land was a turfa extraction site until about 15 years ago. Commercial peat mining. They pulled out maybe 40,000 tons before the operation shut down." Turfa, the Portuguese word for peat. Why did they shut down? A long pause. Equipment failures mostly. Machinery kept breaking down. Workers reported unusual conditions. Health department finally pulled their permits. After hanging up, I sat staring at my excavation through the kitchen window. Commercial peat extraction would explain the deposits, but not their current condition. Extracted peat left behind mud and water, not intact formations, and it certainly didn't explain the footprints. I spent the afternoon in town, researching property records at the municipal office. The land had indeed been mined for 15 years, until 2008. The operation employed dozens of workers and extracted vast quantities of peat for agricultural use. But the records were oddly incomplete. Missing reports from the final 2 years, gaps in production data, no clear explanation for the shutdown. The elderly clerk who helped me search through the files grew increasingly uncomfortable as I asked more questions. "Strange business, that mine," she finally admitted. "Workers kept quitting, said the peat was restless. Made no sense, but you couldn't keep crews more than a few weeks." "Restless how?" She shrugged, but her eyes avoided mine. "Just talk. People said the extracted peat would move on its own, settle back into the extraction sites overnight. Machinery would sink into solid ground between shifts. Foolishness, mostly." But as I drove home that evening, her words echoed in my mind. Restless peat. Ground that moved on its own. I thought about my self-extinguishing fires, the smell that seemed to rise from below, those shifting footprints in my excavation. That night, I dreamed of walking. Not my own walking. I was motionless in my bed. But the sensation of feet pressing into soft earth, of moving through darkness beneath the ground. In the dream, I could feel the weight of soil above me, the pressure of roots and stones and the foundations of my cabin. I was part of something larger, something that had been compressed and burned and extracted, but never truly removed. I woke to the smell of burnt earth so strong it made me gag. The house was shaking slightly, a rhythmic tremor that seemed to come from deep underground. Through my bedroom window, I could see my excavation in the moonlight, and the dark shapes moving within it. They looked like people at first glance, but wrong in proportions and movement. Too fluid, as if made of the earth itself. They moved through the peat layer like swimmers, surfacing and submerging in the carbonized soil. As I watched, frozen in my bed, one of them turned toward the cabin. Its face was a smooth impression in dark earth, featureless except for 2 deep hollows where eyes might be. I blinked, and they were gone. The excavation lay still and empty in the moonlight, just disturbed earth and shadows. But the tremor continued, and now I could hear it clearly, a rhythmic pressing, like footsteps, coming from directly beneath the cabin. The sound continued until dawn, then faded with the first light. When I finally worked up the courage to check the excavation, I found it filled with what looked like fresh footprints, all leading up from the peat layer toward my foundation. I stood at the edge of that hole for an hour, camera in hand, documenting everything. The prints were larger now, more defined, and unmistakably human in shape, but they emerged from solid peat, as if their makers had walked through stone to reach the surface. The rational part of my mind insisted on geological explanations: ground settling, thermal expansion, moisture migration. But 43 years of fieldwork had taught me to recognize phenomena that fell outside normal parameters. Whatever was happening here defied conventional geology. I spent the morning researching historical records online, searching for any mention of unusual geological activity in the San Joaquin region. Most sources described typical highland formations: granite bedrock, well-drained soils, normal sedimentary processes. But buried in an obscure academic paper from 1987, I found a brief mention of anomalous organic formations discovered during the initial peat survey. The paper's author, Dr. Maria Santos, had noted unprecedented preservation of organic impressions in carbonized material and thermal activity inconsistent with known geological processes. Her research had been cut short when the commercial extraction began, and she'd apparently never published follow-up studies. I managed to track down her contact information through the university directory. She was retired now, living in Porto Alegre. But when I called and mentioned the San Joaquin peat deposits, her response was immediate. "You're living on that land?" Her voice carried an urgency that made my stomach tighten. "How long have you been there?" 3 weeks. "Have you disturbed the soil? Dug anything?" I described my well excavation, the peat formations, the footprints. The silence on the other end stretched so long I thought the connection had failed. "Dr. Santos?" "Leave," she said quietly. "Leave immediately. Don't try to fill the excavation. Don't disturb anything else. Just go. I don't understand. That peat isn't natural. It's preserved organic matter, but not from plants. The thermal carbonization process, it shouldn't be possible under normal conditions. Whatever created those formations is still active." She hung up before I could ask more questions. I stood in my kitchen, phone still in hand, watching my excavation through the window. In daylight, it looked harmless enough, just a hole in the ground filled with dark earth. But as I watched, I noticed movement. Subtle at first, like heat shimmer, but becoming more distinct. The peat layer was shifting, flowing like thick liquid, and new impressions were forming on the surface. I grabbed my camera and rushed outside. Through the telephoto lens, I could see them clearly, fresh footprints appearing in the peat as I watched, as if invisible feet were walking through the carbonized material. They moved in deliberate patterns, circling the excavation, then heading straight toward my cabin. The prints stopped at the foundation. I spent that afternoon in town, ostensibly shopping for supplies but really avoiding my own property. When I finally returned at sunset, I found new disturbances around the cabin's perimeter. The ground near the foundation looked churned, as if something had been moving just beneath the surface. Dark stains marked the wooden skirting, and the smell of burnt earth was stronger than ever. That night, I didn't even attempt to sleep in the cabin. I rolled out my sleeping bag in the truck bed, doors locked, engine running for heat. Through the windshield, I watched my property with a mixture of fascination and growing dread. The activity began just after midnight. At first, just small movements in the excavation, ripples in the peat layer, like something large swimming beneath the surface. Then the ground around the cabin began to bulge and settle in rhythmic patterns. Whatever was down there was moving, pressing upward, testing the boundaries between the buried world and the surface. Around 2 a.m., I saw them clearly for the first time. They emerged from the excavation like swimmers breaking the surface of a lake, but the medium they moved through was solid earth. Human-shaped but wrong in their proportions, made of compressed peat and carbon, and something else I couldn't identify. They moved with purpose, circling the cabin, pressing against the foundation with their earthen hands. I wanted to start the truck and drive away, but some part of me, the scientist, the geologist who'd spent decades seeking rational explanations, needed to understand what I was witnessing. I pulled out my camera, hands shaking, and began documenting. Through the telephoto lens, I could see details that made my rational mind rebel. Their faces were impressions in dark earth, but they moved and shifted like living tissue. Their bodies flowed between solid and liquid states, dense as stone one moment, fluid as mud the next. They pressed against my cabin's foundation with increasing urgency, as if trying to push upward from below. The wooden structure began to settle, not collapse, just sinking slowly into the earth, as if the ground beneath was becoming liquid. The porch steps tilted at odd angles, and I could hear windows cracking from the structural stress. By dawn, they had retreated back into the excavation, leaving behind only disturbed earth and the certainty that my cabin was now several inches lower than it had been the night before. I sat in my truck until full sunlight, then approached the excavation with scientific determination. The peat layer had changed again, new formations rising from the depths like fossilized memories. The footprints were everywhere now, overlapping in complex patterns, all leading to and from the space beneath my cabin. I knelt at the edge of the hole and felt warmth radiating from the carbonized earth. Not the warmth of decomposition or geothermal activity, but something else. The warmth of life, of movement, of something vast and patient waiting just below the surface. The rational explanation was clear now, though it violated everything I knew about geology and physics. This wasn't just peat. It was preserved organic matter from something much older, something that had been compressed and carbonized, but never truly died. The commercial extraction had disturbed a formation that existed in some state between life and fossilization, between past and present. And now it was trying to reclaim what had been taken. I spent the morning packing essentials, loading my truck with clothes and important documents. Dr. Santos was right. I needed to leave. But as I prepared to abandon the cabin, I faced the question that had haunted me since discovering the footprints. Should I fill the excavation, try to contain whatever was down there, or leave it open? Filling it might trap the formation, force it to find other ways to reach the surface. But leaving it open felt like an invitation for something I didn't understand to emerge fully into the world above. I stood at the edge of my excavation, shovel in hand, feeling the warmth rise from the peat layer below. The impressions shifted as I watched, new footprints forming in patterns that seemed almost like communication. Urgent, insistent, reaching upward toward the light. Behind me, my cabin continued its slow descent into earth that was no longer solid, no longer quite separate from the living formation beneath. The smell of burnt earth filled the air, and I could hear movement below, not the random settling of soil, but the deliberate motion of something that had been compressed and extracted and burned, but had never truly stopped walking. The question remained, what was I supposed to do with this knowledge? Was this a geological phenomenon that needed scientific study, or something that should remain buried? The footprints in the peat seemed to pulse with warmth as I watched, and for a moment I could swear I felt the ground beneath my own feet respond, as if the earth itself was preparing to welcome me into its compressed and carbonized embrace. I set down the shovel and walked back to my truck, leaving the excavation open behind me. Some mysteries, I realized, were meant to remain unsolved, some depths better left unexplored. Whether what I'd witnessed was real, or the product of isolation and an aging mind, I could no longer trust myself to make that distinction. As I drove away, I watched my cabin in the rearview mirror, still settling into earth that moved like water, like memory, like something that had been waiting decades for someone to dig deep enough to find it. The last thing I saw before the trees blocked my view was movement in the excavation, dark shapes emerging from the peat, standing upright in the sunlight, turning their impression faces toward the retreating sound of my truck. I never went back to discover whether they ever fully emerged, whether the cabin eventually disappeared completely into that living ground, or whether the whole experience was simply the product of too much solitude and a mind unprepared for retirement. Some questions, I've learned, carry answers too heavy for rational thought to bear. But sometimes, on warm nights when the earth seems to breathe beneath my feet wherever I am now, I remember the smell of burnt earth and the warmth rising from compressed time. And I wonder if somewhere near San Joaquin, those footprints are still walking through the dark peat, still pressing upward toward a surface world they never quite managed to reach. Story 3. The first time I noticed him, I was reviewing quarterly reports on the 14th floor of the Millennium Building in downtown Belo Horizonte. The late afternoon sun cast harsh shadows through my office window, and across the narrow alley, the dark glass facade of the adjacent building reflected everything with unsettling clarity. That's when I saw myself, or what I thought was myself, staring back from the opposite window. Nothing unusual about seeing your own reflection, except this one was wrong. Subtly, impossibly wrong. I raised my hand to adjust my tie, and the figure in the dark glass did the same. But a full second later, as if the image had to travel some impossible distance before reaching me. The delay was so brief, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. But something cold settled in my stomach, a primitive recognition that what I was seeing shouldn't exist. I work as a financial analyst for Meridian Accounting, spending my days buried in spreadsheets and client portfolios. Logic is my profession, order my obsession. Numbers don't lie, patterns don't deceive, and reflections certainly don't operate on delays. Yet as I sat there, watching the figure across the alley mirror my movements with that unsettling lag, I felt the first hairline crack in my rational world. The building across from us housed another corporate complex, floors of identical offices with tinted windows so dark they were nearly opaque during the day. I'd worked here for 3 years and never seen movement behind that glass, never noticed lights or signs of occupancy. The building seemed to swallow light rather than reflect it, creating a perfect black mirror that stretched up 12 stories. I leaned back in my chair, and my reflection did the same. 1 Mississippi later, I blinked, and the figure blinked back after that same impossible pause. The fluorescent lights above my head flickered, casting stuttering shadows across my keyboard, and I felt a bead of sweat trace down my spine despite the aggressive air conditioning. "You're losing it, Leandro," I whispered to myself. But even as I spoke, I couldn't look away from the window. The figure across the alley seemed to be watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. That evening, I mentioned the strange reflection to my colleague Marcus as we waited for the elevator. He glanced toward the windows, with the practiced disinterest of someone who'd worked in corporate buildings too long. "Tinted glass can create weird visual effects," he said, pressing the down button repeatedly. "Heat distortion, light refraction. Happens all the time in these modern buildings." His explanation made perfect sense, but it didn't explain the delay. It didn't explain why I could feel eyes on me even when I wasn't looking at the window. And it certainly didn't explain what happened the next day. I arrived at the office early before sunrise, hoping to finish the Henderson audit before the morning meetings. The building was nearly empty, just the cleaning crew and a few other early arrivals scattered across 30 floors. I switched on my computer and fell into the familiar rhythm of spreadsheet analysis. But something kept pulling my attention to the window. Dawn was breaking over the city, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and the dark glass across the alley was beginning to catch the first rays of sunlight. As the light shifted, I saw him again, the figure in the opposite window. But this time, he was already there, waiting. I hadn't moved yet, hadn't given him anything to mirror, but he was standing at what looked like a desk, facing my direction. The early morning light made it easier to see details, and what I saw made my throat tighten. The figure wore the same blue shirt I had on, the same navy tie, even the same silver watch on his left wrist. But his posture was different, more confident, more assertive than I'd ever felt in my life. As I watched, paralyzed by a fear I couldn't name, The figure raised his hand in a slow, deliberate wave. I didn't wave back. I couldn't. My hands were frozen on my keyboard, every muscle in my body locked in place. But the figure continued his gesture, completing the wave with what looked disturbingly like a smile. The rest of that morning passed in a haze of distraction. I made errors in calculations I could normally do in my sleep, transposed numbers, forgot to save files. During the lunch break, I called the property management company for the building across the alley, claiming I was interested in renting office space. The representative laughed. "That building's been vacant for 2 years," she told me. "Asbestos remediation and structural issues. It's not even safe to enter." I hung up and stared across the alley at the dark windows, at the figure I could swear was still there, still watching. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that deliberate wave, that impossible smile. I found myself checking my reflection in every mirror in my apartment, searching for some sign that what I'd seen was real, some evidence that I wasn't slowly losing my mind. The third day brought new horrors. I was in a client meeting when my phone buzzed with a security alert from the building's access system. According to the log, my keycard had been used to enter the building at 11:47 p.m. the previous night. I was asleep at home at 11:47 p.m. I had my keycard in my wallet, had it there all evening. During my lunch break, I went to building security. Tom, the guard I'd known for 3 years, pulled up the access logs on his computer and frowned. "Says here you badged in at 11:47 last night, badged out at 2:33 a.m., he said, scrolling through the data. "Weird time to be working, Leandro." I showed him my keycard, still in my wallet where it had been all night. Tom's frown deepened as he checked the card's magnetic strip and ran it through the scanner. It worked perfectly. "Must be some kind of system glitch," he concluded, but his eyes didn't meet mine as he said it. That afternoon, I couldn't concentrate on anything except the window across the alley. The figure was there again, clearer than ever in the afternoon light. He seemed to be working at his desk, typing on an invisible keyboard, occasionally reaching for what might have been a coffee cup. The mundane nature of his actions made everything worse somehow, as if this other version of me was living a parallel life just out of reach. I started taking pictures with my phone, dozens of them, trying to capture evidence of what I was seeing. But every photo showed only empty black windows, undisturbed reflections of my own office. The camera couldn't see what my eyes insisted was there. By the fourth day, I was barely functional. I'd started arriving earlier and earlier, hoping to catch the building across the alley truly empty, hoping to prove to myself that the figure was just some trick of light and exhaustion. But he was always there first, always waiting at his window like he belonged there more than I belonged in mine. The access log showed more unauthorized entries. My keycard was supposedly used 3 more times in the middle of the night, always during hours when I could prove I was elsewhere. I had dinner receipts, security camera footage from my apartment building, witnesses who could vouch for my whereabouts. But the logs didn't lie, and my keycard never left my possession. I bought a small security camera and positioned it to monitor my office overnight. If someone was using my identity, if someone was somehow duplicating my keycard, I would catch them. The camera recorded continuously, uploading footage to a cloud server every hour. The next morning, I reviewed the footage with shaking hands. The timestamp showed 11:52 p.m., just a few minutes after the access log indicated my keycard had been used. The camera angle captured my desk, my chair, and the window behind it. In the video, I watched myself enter the frame. But it wasn't me. It couldn't be me. The figure moved with a confidence I'd never possessed, sat straighter in my chair than I ever had, typed with a fluid efficiency that made my own hunt and peck style look childish. He worked steadily for nearly 3 hours, occasionally glancing toward the camera with what looked like amusement, as if he knew I would be watching. Toward the end of the footage, the figure stopped typing and turned to face the window that looked out across the alley. He stared at the dark glass for a long moment, then slowly raised his hand and pressed it against the window. The gesture was oddly intimate, like someone touching their lover's face through a barrier. Then he turned back to the camera, looked directly into the lens and smiled. It was my face, undeniably my face. But the expression was wrong. Too knowing, too satisfied. The smile of someone who had won a game I didn't even know I was playing. I deleted the footage immediately, then sat staring at my computer screen for the rest of the morning. The logical explanations were exhausted. Security glitches, light distortions, stress-induced hallucinations. None of them could account for the video, for the access logs, for the growing certainty that someone else was living pieces of my life. I started staying later at the office, trying to outlast whatever was happening, trying to be there when the unauthorized access occurred. But every night, I would eventually succumb to exhaustion and go home. And every morning, the logs would show another late-night visit. The figure across the alley was becoming bolder, more active. During meetings, I would catch glimpses of him pacing behind his window, gesticulating as if he were giving presentations to invisible colleagues. Sometimes he would stop and stare directly at me, raising his hand in that slow, deliberate wave that had become his signature greeting. My coworkers started asking if I was feeling well. My productivity had plummeted, my attention span reduced to minutes at a time. I found myself checking the window compulsively, monitoring the dark glass across the alley for signs of movement, for proof that I wasn't completely losing my mind. 2 weeks after it all started, I made a decision. I would confront whatever was happening, would force some kind of resolution before I completely unraveled. I equipped myself with every recording device I could carry. Phone cameras, digital recorders, even an old Polaroid camera I'd bought at a pawn shop, thinking that maybe analog technology could capture what digital sensors missed. I arrived at the office before dawn and positioned myself at the window. The building across the alley was dark, seemingly empty, but I knew he was there. I could feel his presence like pressure in my ears, like the moment before thunder. As the sun rose and light began to creep across the glass facade, I saw him materialize in the opposite window, but this time he wasn't at his desk. He was standing at his window, hands pressed against the glass, staring directly at me. Even at this distance, I could see his expression clearly. Not the confident smile I'd grown accustomed to, but something hungrier, more desperate. I raised my phone and started recording, then grabbed the Polaroid and began taking pictures. Through my phone screen, I could see only empty windows, but the figure was right there, close enough that I could see the individual threads in his tie, the slight 5 o'clock shadow along his jaw. The Polaroid whirred and dispensed photo after photo. I shook them impatiently, watching the images develop. Empty windows, dark glass, nothing. But when I looked up from the photos, the figure had moved closer to his window, so close that his breath was fogging the glass. He raised one hand and began tracing letters on the condensation, writing them backwards so I could read them from my side. HELPME. My phone slipped from my nerveless fingers and clattered to the floor. When I looked up again, the figure was gone, but the message remained on the window for a few more seconds before the condensation faded. I spent the rest of that day in a state of numb shock, going through the motions of work while my mind raced through every possible explanation. Hallucinations, elaborate pranks, some kind of sophisticated projection system. Nothing fit the evidence. Nothing explained the access logs or the security footage. That evening, I stayed in the office until well past midnight, determined to finally see what happened during those unauthorized visits. I hid behind my desk with a clear view of both the door and the window, every recording device I owned ready to capture whatever occurred. At 11:43 p.m., I heard the soft beep of a keycard at the door. My heart hammered against my ribs as the handle turned and the door opened. I raised my phone to record, finger poised over the camera button, but no one entered. The door swung open on empty air, stayed open for exactly 4 minutes according to my watch, then closed with another soft beep. The access log would show an entry at 11:43, an exit at 11:47, but I had seen nothing. Yet something had changed. I could feel it in the air, a subtle shift in temperature, in pressure, in the quality of light from the window. When I finally worked up the courage to peek over my desk, I saw him clearly in the window across the alley. Not a reflection this time, but a figure standing in what should have been an empty, condemned building. He was looking directly at me, and this time his expression was unmistakably one of triumph. He raised his hand in that familiar wave, but now I understood it wasn't a greeting. It was goodbye. The next morning, I arrived at the office to find my key card no longer worked. Security informed me that my employment had been terminated, effective immediately, due to unauthorized access and suspicious behavior. My supervisor, a woman I'd worked with for 2 years, looked at me with polite confusion when I tried to explain. "I'm sorry, but I don't believe we've met," she said. "Are you sure you have the right company?" I produced business cards, showed her emails with her own name in the signature, pulled up project files I'd created. But in her computer, all those files showed a different creator, a different author. Every trace of my work, my presence, my 3 years with the company had been systematically replaced. As security escorted me from the building, I looked up at my former office window on the 14th floor. A figure stood there, silhouetted against the glass, wearing a blue shirt and navy tie. He raised his hand in a wave, and this time I understood. I was looking up at myself, the self I should have been, the self I could have been if I'd been more confident, more assertive, more deserving of the life I'd been living. The reflection had become real, and I had become the reflection. Now I stand across the alley in what everyone insists is an empty building, though it feels solid enough beneath my feet. I watch him living my life, attending my meetings, dating the woman I'd been too shy to ask out. He's better at being me than I ever was. Sometimes, late at night, I see someone else at a window in another building, someone who looks lost and confused and desperate. When they notice me watching, I press my hand against the glass and trace letters in the condensation. HELPME. But they never seem to understand. They never realize they're looking at themselves. In Story 4, the leather still smells like him. Pipe tobacco and Old Spice aftershave. A scent that should comfort, but instead makes my stomach clench. Dad's chair sits in my apartment now, occupying the corner where my reading lamp used to cast gentle light. Now the shadows seem deeper there, pooling around the worn burgundy leather like dark water. I inherited it 3 weeks ago, along with the house where I grew up, and a lifetime of guilt I'm still learning to carry. The movers struggled with its weight, cursing under their breath as they maneuvered it up 2 flights of stairs. "Heavy old thing," one of them muttered, and I wanted to tell him it wasn't the chair, it was everything it contained. The first time I fell asleep in it was an accident. I'd been working late on a German technical manual about industrial heating systems. The kind of mind-numbing translation work that pays the bills but slowly erodes your soul. My eyes grew heavy around midnight, and the next thing I knew I was gasping awake at 3 in the morning with the sensation of powerful arms wrapped around my chest. Not hands. Arms. Thick, muscular forearms pressing against my ribs with surprising gentleness, like the embrace I'd wanted from him but never received. The feeling lingered for several heartbeats after I opened my eyes. A phantom pressure that made me question whether I was truly awake. I told myself it was just a muscle spasm, the kind of thing that happens when you fall asleep in an awkward position. But even as I stumbled to my actual bed, I could swear I felt eyes watching me from the chair's depths. The dreams started the second week. In them, Dad looked exactly as he had 5 years ago, before the stroke that stole his words and left him staring at me with frustrated eyes. He wore his favorite brown cardigan with the torn elbow, the one Mom had thrown away after the funeral. He would appear beside the chair, holding what looked like a journal I'd never seen before, bound in cracked black leather with pages that seemed to glow faintly in the dream light. He never spoke, couldn't speak, but he would open the journal and point to specific passages. Lines of text swam before my eyes, written in his careful handwriting, but always there were sections crossed out in violent red ink. The strikes were so heavy they tore through the paper, rendering the words beneath completely illegible. Dad would tap these sections with increasing urgency, his finger leaving dark smudges on the pages, his mouth moving soundlessly as if trying to communicate something vital. I would wake with a start, chest tight with the familiar pressure of those phantom arms. But what disturbed me most wasn't the dream itself. It was how desperately I wanted to return to it. to see what words lay hidden beneath those angry red marks. On a gray Tuesday morning, I drove to the old house for the first time since the funeral. I'd been putting it off, making excuses about work deadlines and the complexity of probate. But the dreams were intensifying, and I needed to find that journal, if it existed at all. The house felt smaller than I remembered, shrunken somehow, like a sweater left too long in hot water. Everything was exactly as Dad had left it. Mom's china still displayed in the cabinet, his reading glasses folded on the kitchen table beside yesterday's crossword puzzle. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock that had marked time through my entire childhood. I searched methodically, his bedroom first, then the study where he'd worked on his own translations before his retirement. I went through desk drawers, closets, even the basement storage room where boxes of our family's history moldered in the damp. Nothing. No black leather journal. No evidence that such a thing had ever existed. But in the living room, where his chair had sat for 30 years, I found something else. The wall behind where the chair had been was covered in faint pencil marks. At first glance, they looked like scribbles, the kind of absent-minded doodling you might do while talking on the phone. But as I examined them more closely, I realized they were words, fragments of sentences, most of them scratched out so heavily the pencil had gouged small holes in the drywall. My hands trembled as I knelt beside the wall. The handwriting was unmistakably his, though shakier than I remembered. I could make out partial phrases, never meant for, and should have told, and the weight of. All of it crossed out with the same violent intensity I'd seen in the dreams. Red pencil marks this time, still fresh-looking despite the layer of dust that coated everything else in the room. I spent hours there, crouched on my knees, trying to decipher the hidden words. But the more I stared, the more the marks seemed to shift and blur, as if they were written in ink that hadn't quite dried. By the time I drove home that evening, my vision was swimming and a dull headache pulsed behind my eyes. That night, I avoided the chair entirely, working at my kitchen table until exhaustion forced me to bed. But sleep brought no relief. In my dreams, Dad stood in my apartment now, pointing at the wall behind his relocated chair. When I looked, I saw the same scratched-out words appearing there, as if his desperate messages were following me home. I woke to find myself standing in my living room at 4 a.m, my fingers black with pencil lead. The wall behind the chair was covered in fresh markings, my own handwriting this time, but in the same frantic style. Words I didn't remember writing, crossed out before I could read them, a palimpsest of failed communication written by my own sleeping hand. The pattern established itself over the following days. I would work late, fighting exhaustion, but eventually the chair would call to me. The leather had grown softer somehow, more yielding, as if it were slowly conforming to my body. I would tell myself I'd just rest my eyes for a moment, just until the tension in my shoulders eased. Then the arms would come, stronger each time, holding me with an intimacy that was both comforting and terrifying. The pressure against my chest felt protective at first, like being held by someone who cared deeply about keeping me safe. But as the nights passed, the embrace grew tighter, more insistent, until I would wake, gasping for air, my ribs aching as if I'd been squeezed in a vice. The wall behind the chair was becoming a palimpsest of madness. Each morning brought new markings, layer upon layer of scratched-out text and handwriting that shifted between his and mine until I could no longer tell them apart. Sometimes I would catch glimpses of coherent phrases before the red marks consumed them. Forgive me, and never wanted, and so much I never said. But the meaning remained tantalizingly out of reach, erased as quickly as it appeared. My work began to suffer. I missed deadlines, turned in translations so riddled with errors that clients started complaining. My apartment grew cluttered with half-finished projects, empty takeout containers, and notebooks filled with my desperate attempts to decode the wall's messages. I stopped answering my phone, stopped checking email, stopped pretending that anything mattered except understanding what Dad was trying to tell me. Because I was certain now that it was him. In the deeper dreams, the ones that came when the arms held me longest, I could see him more clearly, He looked younger, healthier, but his eyes held a desperate sadness that cut through me like winter wind. He would mouth words I couldn't hear, gesture frantically at the journal pages, his fingers pointing to specific sections with increasing urgency. The journal itself was changing too. What had started as a simple black notebook was becoming something else. Thicker, older, its pages yellowed and brittle. Sometimes I could swear I saw my own name written there in his careful script, surrounded by text so heavily redacted, it looked like abstract art. Other times the pages appeared blank, as if the words were there, but somehow beyond my ability to perceive them. 3 weeks into this routine, I made a discovery that shattered what remained of my rational mind. I had been documenting the wall markings, photographing them each morning before the next night's editions appeared. But when I compared the photos, I realized something impossible. The older markings weren't fading or being covered over. They were moving. Words would migrate from one section of the wall to another between photographs, like magnetic poetry rearranging itself. Sentences that had been incomplete would suddenly finish themselves in different locations, their red strike-throughs following them like surgical scars. It was as if the wall had become a living document, constantly editing and revising itself in search of some perfect, unattainable message. I began sleeping in the chair deliberately then, no longer fighting the pull. The rational part of my mind screamed warnings about obsession and breakdown, but I silenced it with the desperate logic of the drowning man who mistakes anchor for lifeline. Whatever was happening to me, whatever message Dad was trying to convey, it felt more important than anything else in my increasingly narrow world. The arms grew stronger, more possessive. They would hold me so tightly now that I could feel my pulse beating against their pressure. A rhythm that seemed to sync with the grandfather clock I could somehow hear ticking despite being miles away in the empty house. Sometimes I would wake with bruises on my ribs, dark fingerprint-shaped marks that I photographed obsessively, as if they were evidence of something I needed to prove to a skeptical jury. But prove to whom? I had no visitors, no friends checking on me, no colleagues wondering why the reliable translator had suddenly become unreliable. The isolation was complete, perfect, like being trapped in amber while the world continued moving around me. In my deepest dreams now, the ones that felt more real than waking, Dad would show me new pages of the journal. But these weren't filled with text. They contained images, photographs I'd never seen before, moments from my childhood that seemed familiar yet wrong somehow. There I was at 8 years old, building a treehouse with him in our backyard. But in the photos, his face was obscured by shadow, his hands reaching toward me with a hunger that made my sleeping self recoil. Another image, my high school graduation, Dad clapping in the audience. But the photo captured something my memory had blocked, the way his eyes never left me, even when Mom was speaking to him, even when other parents called his name. The intensity of his gaze in that frozen moment was so overwhelming I would wake crying, though I couldn't say whether from fear or loss. The wall had become entirely covered now, a maze of text so dense it looked like abstract art. Standing before it each morning felt like confronting an ancient language I should understand but couldn't quite grasp. The red strike-throughs had multiplied exponentially, creating a layered effect that hurt to look at directly. Sometimes, if I stared long enough, I could swear I saw patterns emerging, words that had been crossed out so many times they'd burned themselves into shadow impressions beneath the surface markings. It was during one of these morning examinations that I finally understood what I was looking at. The wall wasn't covered in random fragments of text. It was the same message, written over and over again in hundreds of different ways, each version crossed out and rewritten, as if he could never find the right words to express what needed saying. And in that moment of recognition, I felt the chair behind me, felt it even though I was standing 3 feet away. The leather was whispering, creaking with the subtle movements of an occupied seat. When I turned, I expected to see Dad sitting there, waiting for me to finally understand. Instead, I saw myself. Not a reflection, not a hallucination, but myself as I appeared in the deepest dreams, pale, hollow-eyed, wearing clothes I didn't remember putting on. This other me was writing on the wall, his hand moving in the same frantic patterns I'd witnessed in my sleep. But his eyes were fixed on the chair, watching something I couldn't see. his face twisted with an expression of desperate longing. I blinked, and the vision vanished. But the sound remained. The whisper of pencil on drywall, the soft scratch of words being born and immediately murdered by red ink. The chair was empty now, but it was waiting. It had always been waiting. That night I didn't fight the pull. I settled into the leather with the resignation of a man walking toward his execution, knowing that whatever revelation awaited me would likely destroy what remained of my sanity. The familiar arms encircled me immediately, tighter than ever before, squeezing until black spots danced at the edges of my vision. But this time, Dad didn't appear with his journal. Instead, I found myself standing in my childhood bedroom, exactly as it had been 30 years ago. Everything was smaller than I remembered. The bed, the desk, the window that had seemed so impossibly high when I was 8 years old. And there, sitting on the edge of the bed, was my father. Not the old man who had died of a stroke, but the vital man from my childhood, strong and confident and somehow terrible in his perfection. He looked at me with those same hungry eyes from the photographs, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades of silence. "I never found the right words," he said, and his voice was exactly as I remembered it, warm and deep and utterly convincing. Every letter I started, every conversation I planned, every time I tried to tell you how much you meant to me. But the words were never right. They were never enough. I tried to speak, to ask him what he meant, but my dream voice wouldn't work. He stood and moved toward me, and I could smell that familiar mixture of tobacco and aftershave, so strong it made my eyes water. "I wrote it all down," he continued, reaching out to touch my face with hands that felt real and solid and impossible. "Every feeling, every moment I watched you and wanted to say something but couldn't. It's all there, behind all those marks. But I kept crossing it out because what if you couldn't understand? What if you thought I was—" His voice trailed off, and in the silence I could hear something else. The sound of my own adult voice, mumbling and incoherent, as if I were talking in my sleep. But I wasn't asleep. I was here, in this place that existed somewhere between memory and dream, listening to confessions that had been 40 years in the making. "You have to read it," he said, his hand still on my cheek, and I could feel the weight of all those unspoken words pressing down on me like water. "You have to see past the marks and read what I really wrote. It's the only way I can let go." I woke in the chair with tears on my face and the taste of copper in my mouth. The arms were gone, but I could still feel their phantom pressure, lighter now, as if their grip was finally loosening. Dawn was breaking outside my windows, casting gray light across the wall of markings. But something had changed. As I approached the wall, I realized that the red strike-throughs were fading, becoming transparent. And beneath them, in handwriting that was somehow both his and mine, I could finally read the words that had been hidden all along. They weren't the profound revelations I'd expected. No dark secrets or dramatic confessions. Just simple, heartbreaking honesty. "I love you, and I never knew how to show it. I was proud of you every day, but the words got stuck. I watched you grow up and wanted to hold on to every moment. I was afraid you'd think I was weak if I cried when you graduated. I saved every story you wrote in 2nd grade. I practiced conversations with you that I never had the courage to start. Page after page of ordinary love, written in desperate fragments by a man who had spent a lifetime choking on his own emotions. Nothing supernatural or terrifying, just the accumulated weight of everything left unsaid between a father and son. I read until my eyes burned, until the sun was fully up and the wall had returned to its normal appearance. But the words remained clear in my memory, each phrase a small forgiveness, a bridge built across 40 years of careful distance. When I finally looked at the chair, it seemed different somehow, lighter. The leather had lost its supernatural softness, reverting to the ordinary wear patterns of 3 decades of use. It was just furniture again, holding nothing more than the faint scent of pipe tobacco and the accumulated weight of ordinary human love. I never slept in the chair again. But I kept it, placed where I could see it from my desk, a reminder that some messages take a lifetime to deliver, and sometimes the most profound truths are hidden beneath our attempts to silence them. The wall stayed blank after that morning, but I no longer needed it to speak, because I had finally learned to listen to the things that were never said, and in that listening, found a forgiveness I hadn't known I was carrying. The pressure around my chest was gone now, replaced by something lighter, not emptiness, but space for all the conversations we might have had in a different world, where fathers and sons find the courage to name their love out loud. Sometimes, late at night when I'm working on a particularly difficult translation, I catch myself looking toward the chair and wondering if love itself is just another language we spend our lives learning to speak, crossing out our failed attempts until we finally find the words that bridge the space between one heart and another. The chair waits in its corner, patient and silent, no longer a vessel for desperate messages, but simply a place where stories begin and end, where the unspeakable finally finds its voice, and where the living learn to forgive the dead for being human. Story 5. The first time I heard it, I thought someone was torturing a violin in the depths of the forest. I had been walking the perimeter of my property in rural Paraná, something I did most evenings when the heat finally broke and the air became breathable again. The cicadas were already beginning their nightly symphony, but underneath their familiar drone came something else entirely, a sound that made my teeth ache and my spine contract involuntarily. 3 discordant notes, held long and wavering, as if drawn from strings that had never known proper tuning. They seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere, bouncing off the dense canopy above and seeping up from the forest floor like audio fog. I stopped walking, my hand instinctively reaching for the small flashlight clipped to my belt, though darkness was still an hour away. The sound ceased as abruptly as it had begun. I stood there for several minutes, straining to hear anything beyond the normal cacophony of the Brazilian countryside, the distant lowing of cattle, the rustle of leaves in the evening breeze, the high whine of mosquitoes beginning their nightly hunt. Nothing. I convinced myself it had been a trick of acoustics, perhaps some farm equipment echoing strangely through the valley, and continued my walk. That was 3 weeks ago. I should have turned around then. My name is Marcus Chen, and I've been teaching music theory at the rural campus of Universidade Estadual do Paraná for nearly 15 years. I moved here from São Paulo partly for the slower pace of life, but mostly because the sounds of the city had begun to overwhelm me in ways I couldn't articulate to my colleagues or the handful of friends I'd left behind. Here, surrounded by 37 acres of mostly untouched Atlantic forest, I could finally hear myself think. Or so I believed. The property came with 2 German short-haired pointers named Rex and Bella, inherited from the previous owner who'd moved to the coast to live with his daughter. They were well-trained hunting dogs, calm and obedient, with an almost supernatural ability to detect approaching storms hours before the first clouds appeared on the horizon. In all my time here, I'd never heard them bark unnecessarily or show aggression toward anything except the occasional opossum that ventured too close to their food bowls. That changed the morning after my evening walk. I was grading theory assignments on the covered porch when both dogs suddenly went rigid, their heads turning in perfect synchronization toward the tree line approximately 50 meters from the house. Rex's hackles rose first, a ridge of coarse hair standing straight along his spine like a warning flag. Bella followed suit seconds later, and then both began to growl, not the playful rumble they used when wrestling with each other, but a low, continuous sound that seemed to vibrate through the wooden deck beneath my feet. I followed their gaze but saw nothing unusual. The forest edge looked exactly as it always did. A wall of green so dense it was nearly black in the shadows between the trunks. Cecropia trees with their distinctive palmate leaves, strangler figs wrapping ancient trunks in their deadly embrace, and dozens of species I'd never bothered to learn the names of, all competing for whatever sunlight managed to penetrate the canopy. "What is it, guys?" I asked, setting down my papers and walking to the porch railing. Rex turned briefly to look at me, his brown eyes filled with something I'd never seen there before. Not quite fear, but a profound unease that made my stomach clench. Then he turned back to the forest and resumed his growling, which Bella had never stopped. I watched them for nearly 20 minutes before they finally relaxed, but even then they remained alert, occasionally lifting their heads to stare at the same spot among the trees. When I went inside to make lunch, they refused to follow me, choosing instead to maintain their vigil from the porch. That afternoon, I decided to investigate. The section of forest the dogs had been watching was accessible via a narrow game trail that wound between the larger trees and disappeared into the undergrowth after about 30 meters. I'd explored it before during my first few months on the property, finding nothing more interesting than some particularly spectacular orchids and a small clearing where someone had obviously camped years earlier, leaving behind nothing but a circle of stones and some rusted bottle caps. This time felt different. The forest seemed unusually quiet as I followed the trail, my footsteps muffled by years of accumulated leaf litter. Even the insects had apparently decided to take the afternoon off, leaving only the distant sound of wind in the upper branches to break the silence. I was perhaps 15 meters in when I noticed the first strange thing. The trees were swaying. Not all of them, and not in any pattern I could discern. Individual trunks would begin to vibrate almost imperceptibly, then gradually increase the motion until their entire crowns were moving in slow, rhythmic waves. There was no wind at ground level. The air was perfectly still, almost oppressively so, yet branches 40 feet above my head were dancing like kelp in an ocean current. I stopped and looked up, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. As I watched, a massive jatoba tree, perhaps 6 feet in diameter, began its strange dance, starting with a barely perceptible tremor, and building to a motion so pronounced I could hear the wood creaking. The sound it made was disturbingly familiar, a low, sustained note not unlike the lowest string of a double bass. Without thinking, I whistled a quick ascending scale, something I'd done unconsciously since childhood when I was nervous or thinking. The tree's movement immediately intensified, its creaking rising in pitch to match my whistle almost perfectly. When I stopped, the tree gradually returned to stillness. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone to record what was happening, but the screen remained stubbornly black. The battery showed full charge, but the device was completely unresponsive. I tried turning it off and on again, but nothing happened. It was as if the electronics had simply decided to stop functioning. I whistled again, this time a simple C major triad. 3 trees responded simultaneously, their creaking voices creating a harmony so pure and unnatural that I felt the hair on my arms stand up. The sound seemed to hang in the air long after I'd stopped whistling, echoing off the surrounding trunks, until it became impossible to tell which trees were actually moving and which were simply reflecting the sound. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a distortion in my peripheral vision, like heat waves rising from summer asphalt. But as I turned my head to look directly at the spot, the distortion began to take shape. Or perhaps I should say it began to reveal the shape that had been there all along. 3 meters tall, easily, humanoid in the most generous sense of the word, with proportions that suggested something had tried to remember what a person looked like, but had gotten several crucial details wrong. The limbs were too long, the torso too narrow, the head too small and tilted at an angle that should have been anatomically impossible. But strangest of all was the way it seemed to be wrapped in sound itself. Waves of visible distortion flowed around its form like water, and from somewhere within that acoustic shroud came the same 3 discordant notes I'd heard during my evening walk. I tried to run, but my legs felt like they were moving through thick honey. Each step was an enormous effort, and the harder I struggled, the more the forest around me seemed to pulse and sway. The trees were all moving now, their creaking voices joining the entity's dissonant song until the air itself felt thick with sound. Somehow, I made it back to the house. The dogs were waiting for me on the porch, their earlier agitation replaced by what looked almost like relief. As soon as I stumbled up the steps, they flanked me on either side, pressing their warm bodies against my legs as if to anchor me to reality. My phone worked perfectly once I was inside the house, showing the time as 3:47 p.m., exactly when I'd left to explore the trail. According to my watch, however, it was 6:23 p.m. I spent that night researching everything I could find about acoustic phenomena, infrasound, and the psychological effects of certain frequencies on human perception. The scientific literature was vast and contradictory, but several studies suggested that extremely low-frequency sounds could indeed cause hallucinations, panic attacks, and the sensation of being watched. Supposedly, old pipe organs in European cathedrals sometimes produced these frequencies accidentally, leading to reports of ghostly apparitions during services. But that didn't explain the trees, or the dog's behavior, or the missing time. For the next week, I avoided the forest entirely. I graded papers indoors, ate my meals in the kitchen rather than on the porch, and even started sleeping with the bedroom curtains drawn so I couldn't see the tree line. The dogs seemed to approve of this strategy, showing none of their previous interest in watching the forest. Rex even brought me his favorite tennis ball one afternoon, apparently deciding it was safe to play again. I began to convince myself that the whole experience had been some kind of stress-induced episode. The isolation, the upcoming end of the semester, the constant pressure to publish research that no one would ever read. It all made perfect sense. I'd simply had a kind of breakdown, complete with auditory and visual hallucinations. It was embarrassing, but not uncommon among academics, especially those living alone in remote areas. This comfortable rationalization lasted exactly until the thing learned how to mimic human voices. I was working late in my study, transcribing a particularly complex Bach fugue for my advanced students to analyze, when I heard someone calling my name from the direction of the forest. The voice was muffled by distance, but definitely human, with a slight accent I couldn't quite place. "Marcus, help me." I looked up from my work, frowning. None of my neighbors lived close enough for their voices to carry this far, and I hadn't heard any vehicles approaching. The dogs, who had been sleeping peacefully near my desk, were both sitting at attention now, their ears pricked and their eyes fixed on the windows facing the forest. "Marcus, please, I'm lost." This time the voice was closer, and I could hear the distress in it clearly. Someone was definitely in trouble out there. I grabbed a flashlight and headed for the door, but both dogs immediately moved to block my path. Rex actually put his teeth on my wrist, not biting, just holding gently but firmly enough to convey his message. "Marcus." The voice was right outside now, just beyond the circle of light cast by the porch fixtures. I could see nothing but darkness beyond the railing, but the sound was so close the person had to be standing in my yard. I called back, asking who was there and what they needed. The response made my blood freeze. My own voice answered me. Not an imitation or an echo. It was precisely my voice, with my inflection, my slight rasp from years of speaking over chattering students. The voice that responded was absolutely indistinguishable from recordings I'd made of myself lecturing, so perfect that for a moment I wondered if I'd actually spoken without realizing it. "I'm lost," my voice said from the darkness. "Please help me find my way home." I backed away from the door, my hands shaking so badly I could barely maintain my grip on the flashlight. The dogs pressed close to my sides, and I could feel them trembling too. Whatever was out there continued calling for help in my voice for nearly an hour, sometimes from the forest edge, sometimes from what sounded like directly underneath the porch, sometimes from impossible directions like up in the trees or underground. It knew my name. It knew my voice. And somehow, impossibly, it was learning. The next morning, I called the university and told them I needed to take emergency leave. I didn't specify what kind of emergency, and they didn't ask. One of the advantages of working at a small rural campus where personal crises were handled with quiet understanding rather than bureaucratic scrutiny. I needed time to figure out what was happening to me, and I needed help. Dr. Amanda Rice had been my colleague for 8 years before leaving the university to open a private practice in the nearest city. She specialized in stress-related disorders among academics and had successfully treated several professors who'd suffered various kinds of breakdowns over the years. If anyone could help me sort through what was real and what wasn't, it would be her. Our conversation didn't go as I'd hoped. She listened patiently as I described everything that had happened, taking notes in her careful handwriting and asking occasional clarifying questions. When I finished, She set down her pen and looked at me with the kind of expression I'd seen her use with students who were struggling with particularly difficult concepts. Her diagnosis was straightforward: acute stress reaction complicated by isolation-induced psychosis. The acoustic hallucinations were textbook symptoms, as was the paranoid conviction that I was being watched or followed. The missing time episodes and the sensation of external voices mimicking my own were slightly more unusual, but not unprecedented in cases where the patient had a strong background in auditory processing. She recommended immediate medication and suggested I consider moving back to São Paulo, at least temporarily. The isolation was clearly exacerbating whatever underlying condition had triggered the episode, and continuing to live alone in the forest was essentially guaranteeing that my symptoms would worsen. I wanted to believe her. The rational part of my mind desperately wanted to accept her explanation and begin treatment. But as I drove home that evening, I couldn't shake the memory of how the trees had responded to my whistling, or the way the dogs had reacted to something they could clearly perceive, even when I couldn't see it. And then there was the composition. It started as an exercise, something to occupy my mind during the long hours when I was afraid to sleep. I'd been thinking about the 3 discordant notes I'd heard repeatedly. Always the same 3 notes, always in the same sequence, always with that peculiar wavering quality that made them sound like they were being filtered through water or thick glass. Using my digital piano and a basic recording setup, I began trying to recreate those sounds. It was surprisingly difficult. The notes seemed simple enough, but capturing their exact tonal quality proved nearly impossible. I spent hours adjusting frequency, adding reverb, experimenting with different instrumental timbres. Nothing sounded quite right, but as I worked, I began to notice patterns. The 3 notes weren't random. They were part of a larger musical structure, a composition of sorts that followed rules I was only beginning to understand. It was as if I'd been hearing fragments of some vast symphony, and my job was to reconstruct the whole from these incomplete pieces. The work consumed me completely. I found myself staying up until dawn, tweaking individual frequencies and building layer upon layer of harmonic content. The dogs learned to avoid my study during these sessions, retreating to the far end of the house where they couldn't hear what I was creating. After 6 days of obsessive work, I had something resembling a complete piece. 12 minutes of slowly evolving tonal structures built around those 3 original notes. It was unlike anything I'd ever composed before, beautiful in its alien logic, but profoundly unsettling in ways I couldn't articulate. When I played it back for the first time at full volume, every tree within 50 meters of the house began to sway. I watched from my study window as the entire forest edge responded to my composition, trunks moving in perfect synchronization with the music's rhythm. As the piece reached its climax, the movement intensified until it looked like the trees were dancing, their branches weaving through the air in patterns too complex to follow with the naked eye. And in the center of that dancing forest, barely visible through the moving shadows, stood the 3-meter figure I'd encountered on the trail. It was closer now, perhaps 20 meters from the house. Close enough that I could see it more clearly, though I immediately wished I couldn't. The proportions were even more wrong than I'd remembered. Arms that hung nearly to the ground, a torso that seemed to bend in places where human spines simply didn't have joints, and that impossible head tilted at its unnatural angle. But worst of all was the way it moved in perfect harmony with my music, swaying and gesturing as if conducting an orchestra I couldn't see. When the composition reached its crescendo, the figure raised its elongated arms toward my window, and I swear I could see its shadow smile. The piece ended, and the forest returned to stillness. The figure remained for a moment longer, then simply faded away like mist, leaving me staring at empty space between the trees. I knew then that Dr. Rice had been wrong. This wasn't psychosis or stress-induced hallucination. Something was actually out there, something that responded to specific frequencies and musical structures. Something that had been trying to communicate with me from the beginning, teaching me its language one discordant note at a time. The real question wasn't whether I was losing my mind. The real question was whether the thing in the forest was trying to show me something or lure me somewhere I shouldn't go. Tonight, I plan to find out. The dogs are locked safely in the house, with enough food and water for several days if necessary. I've left detailed notes explaining everything that's happened, along with copies of the composition and all my research. If someone finds these documents and I'm not here to explain them, at least there will be some record of what occurred. I'm taking my portable speakers and the completed piece out to the forest clearing. If the entity wants to communicate, I'm going to give it the opportunity. If it wants something from me, I need to know what that is. And if Dr. Rice was right, and I'm simply having an elaborate psychological breakdown, then perhaps confronting these hallucinations directly will finally break whatever cycle I've been trapped in. The sun has set now, and I can hear the familiar 3 notes drifting through the trees, calling to me like a siren song. They're closer than they've ever been before, so close they seem to be coming from just outside my window. It's time to answer. I don't know if I'll return from this encounter, or if I'll want to. But I do know that living in fear of something I don't understand is worse than facing whatever truth is waiting for me in the darkness between the trees. The composition is loaded and ready to play. My flashlight has fresh batteries. The dogs are safe. I can hear my own voice calling to me now from the forest, pleading for help, begging me to come closer. This time I think I will. Story 6. The first time I noticed it, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Working in a century-old jewelry shop in Uro Preto does things to your perception. The way shadows fall through colonial windows, how dust motes dance in afternoon light, the constant tick-tick-tick of dozens of timepieces creating a rhythm that becomes your heartbeat. But this was different. This was wrong. At exactly 5:17 p.m., every clock in my shop stopped. Then, one by one, their hands began moving backward. I've been the 3rd-generation owner of Tempo Eterno for 15 years now, inheriting the business from my father, who inherited it from his. The building itself predates our family's ownership by nearly a century, its thick stone walls and arched doorways, carrying the weight of colonial Brazil's history. Most days, I found comfort in this continuity, this sense of being part of something larger than myself. But that Tuesday afternoon in March, watching those clock hands sweep counterclockwise with deliberate precision, comfort was the furthest thing from my mind. The phenomenon lasted exactly 3 minutes. At 5:20, every timepiece resumed its normal forward march, as if nothing had happened. I checked each one, my father's pristine pocket watches, the ornate wall clocks that had been wedding gifts to forgotten couples, the delicate ladies' wristwatches arranged in the display case like sleeping butterflies. All showed the correct time. All ticked with their usual mechanical certainty. I convinced myself it was stress. Business had been slow, tourist season still months away, and I'd been working longer hours to compensate. The human mind, I reasoned, could manufacture all sorts of illusions when pushed too hard. Then it happened again the next day. Same time, same backward dance of hands. This time, I filmed it with my phone, hands trembling as I held the device steady. When I played back the footage, it showed nothing but normal clocks keeping normal time. The video timestamp read 5:17 p.m., but the clocks in the recording maintained their proper forward progression. That's when the paranoia began to creep in, subtle as morning fog rolling down from the mountains. I started arriving at the shop earlier, leaving later, documenting everything. I counted my inventory obsessively. Every timepiece, every ring, every chain. The numbers never changed, but something felt off, as if the objects themselves had shifted positions when I wasn't looking. The antique coin collection I kept in the main safe seemed particularly affected. Not missing. I counted them religiously now, but somehow different. Duller. As if their metallic luster was slowly fading. The discovery of the first melted coin came on a Friday morning. I found it on my workbench, still warm to the touch, twisted into a perfect spiral that hurt to look at directly. The gold had been transformed into something that belonged more in a modern art gallery than a jewelry shop, its surface rippling with patterns that seemed to move when observed peripherally. I searched the shop thoroughly, looking for signs of break-in, for any logical explanation. Nothing. The locks were secure, the windows intact, the security system armed and uncompromised. Yet there it was. One of my 19th century Brazilian gold pieces, worth several thousand reais, transformed into an impossible sculpture of curved metal. By the following Monday, 3 more coins had undergone the same metamorphosis. Each appeared in a different location, one nestled among the watch repair tools, another balanced on the edge of a display case, the third coiled around the stem of an antique pocket watch like a golden snake. Their warmth was consistent, as if they'd just emerged from a forge, though no heat source existed in the shop capable of such precise melting. The rational part of my mind, the part trained in metallurgy and gemology, educated in the practical sciences that govern my profession, scrambled for explanations. Temperature fluctuations, perhaps, some kind of chemical reaction, a sophisticated prank orchestrated by a competitor or disgruntled customer. But none of these theories could account for the impossible precision of the spirals, the way they seemed to pulse with their own inner light, or the fact that the gold showed no signs of the oxidation that should accompany any heating process. Sleep became elusive. I found myself lying awake, listening to the sounds of the old building settling around me, creaks and groans that had never bothered me before but now seemed loaded with significance. Every noise became a potential intruder, every shadow a threat. I installed additional security cameras, changed the locks, even brought a colleague in to inspect the electrical system for any anomalies that might explain the clock phenomenon. Everything checked out normal. It was during one of these sleepless nights that I decided to research the building's history more thoroughly. I'd always known it was old, built sometime in the 1800s, but I'd never delved into the specific details of its past uses. The municipal archives proved surprisingly helpful once I learned to navigate their maze of handwritten records and faded photographs. What I found changed everything. From 1847 to 1889, the building had served as a private mortuary. The thick stone walls that now housed my clocks had once contained the dead, and the room I used for watch repairs had been the embalming chamber. The revelation hit me like a physical blow, the pieces of a puzzle I hadn't known I was solving suddenly clicking into place, but it was the final detail that made my hands shake as I read. The mortuary had been closed abruptly after a series of complaints about temporal disturbances and unnatural preservation of the bodies. The records were vague, written in the careful language of officials trying to avoid documenting something they couldn't explain. But the pattern was clear. Bodies weren't decomposing properly. Time seemed to affect them differently within those walls. I brought these findings to Dr. Henrique Santos, a local historian who specialized in Ouro Preto's colonial period. A thin man with careful eyes and meticulous mannerisms, he listened to my story with the kind of patient attention I'd hoped for from someone dealing with facts rather than fears. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time, fingers steepled beneath his chin. Finally, he spoke. There have been stories about that building for generations. Nothing official, you understand? Just whispers. People avoiding the street after dark, reports of irregularities. He paused, choosing his words carefully. The kind of irregularities that make rational people question their own perceptions. Dr. Santos suggested I contact Father Miguel, a young priest who had recently arrived at the local parish with an interest in historical anomalies. But when I finally worked up the courage to approach him, his advice was both simple and impossible to implement. Some places hold on to their purpose long after their function has changed. Perhaps what you're experiencing isn't a haunting in the traditional sense, but a kind of temporal echo. He recommended prayer, of course, but also something more practical. In the old days, when a building carried unwanted spiritual residue, they would fill it with consecrated sounds. Bells, specifically. The theory was that the continuous vibration could realign whatever had been disturbed. The idea seemed both mystical and mechanical, appealing to the craftsman in me who understood how vibrations could affect delicate mechanisms. I began researching portable bell concerts, eventually discovering a group of musicians who specialized in campanology, the art of bell ringing. They traveled with a collection of handheld bells of various sizes and tones, creating complex harmonies that filled spaces with layers of sound. Arranging the concert took weeks. The musicians, 3 elderly men who spoke about their instruments with the reverence of priests, needed time to study the acoustic properties of the building, to plan compositions that would resonate properly within its stone walls. During this period, the phenomena intensified. Coins disappeared and reappeared with increasing frequency, always transformed into those impossible spirals. The backward-moving clocks now affected every timepiece in the shop, their reversed choreography so precise it seemed choreographed. Worse, I began experiencing what I could only describe as temporal displacement, moments where I would start a task and suddenly find myself completing it with no memory of the intervening time, or conversations where I would respond to words I couldn't remember hearing. The morning of the concert, I arrived at the shop to find every clock stopped at 5:17. Not just paused, frozen, as if time itself had been suspended. Their faces reflected the early sunlight with an intensity that hurt to look at directly, and when I moved through the shop, I could swear I heard whispers echoing from the walls themselves. The musicians arrived at noon, carrying their bells in velvet-lined cases like precious relics. They moved through the space with professional efficiency, testing acoustics, positioning themselves at specific points throughout the shop. Their leader, a man named Carlos, with hands that spoke of decades working with metal and sound, explained their plan. A continuous performance lasting from 4 p.m. to 6 p.m., designed to encompass and recalibrate whatever temporal disturbance existed. As the afternoon progressed, I found myself watching the frozen clocks with increasing anxiety. Would they remain stuck? Would the phenomenon intensify? Would the bells accomplish whatever supernatural maintenance Father Miguel had suggested? At 4 p.m. sharp, the first bell rang. The sound was unlike anything I'd experienced, not just heard, but felt through every bone, every organ, every molecule of my being. The musicians began their complex harmonies, layers of tone building upon tone until the air itself seemed to vibrate with purpose. The walls absorbed and reflected the sound in ways that defied acoustic logic, creating echoes that lasted longer than they should, harmonics that seemed to originate from within the stone itself. As 5:17 approached, I positioned myself where I could observe every clock in the shop. The bells continued their ethereal chorus, filling the space with vibrations that made my teeth ache and my vision blur slightly at the edges. The musicians played with a concentration that bordered on meditation, their movements synchronized in ways that suggested years of practice or some deeper connection to their art. At exactly 5:17, something shifted. The frozen clocks didn't simply resume their movement. They seemed to exhale, as if they'd been holding their breath for hours. But instead of moving backward as they had for weeks, they began to race forward, their hands spinning with impossible speed. Seconds ticked by and fast forward, minutes compressed into heartbeats, hours passing in the span of moments. The bells grew louder, their harmonies becoming more complex, more urgent. I could feel the sound waves washing over me in visible ripples, distorting my perception of the shop around me. The walls seemed to pulse with each resonant note, and I could swear I saw shapes moving within the stone, shadows of people who had never existed, or who had existed too long ago to matter. Then at 5:20, everything stopped. The bells fell silent with surgical precision. The clocks ceased their frantic forward race and settled into normal time. The shadows within the walls faded. The air itself seemed to sigh with relief. I thanked the musicians and paid them their fee, but their leader lingered after the others had packed their instruments. He studied my face with the kind of attention reserved for evaluating precious metals or diagnosing illnesses. "It's not over," he said quietly. "What we did today, it's a temporary realignment, like tuning a piano that's been left in a damp room. The correction will hold for a while, but the underlying conditions that caused the disturbance remain." He gestured toward the walls around us. Some buildings absorb more than just moisture and heat. They collect moments, experiences, the emotional residue of everything that happens within them. A place that spent 40 years preparing the dead for burial, well, such a place develops its own relationship with time. Before leaving, he handed me a small silver bell, no larger than my thumb. "If it starts again," he said, "ring this at 5:17. It won't stop the phenomenon, but it might moderate it, give you some degree of control." That was 6 months ago. The clocks have remained normal since the concert, keeping proper time with mechanical precision. The coins no longer melt and reshape themselves. The whispers in the walls have fallen silent. Business has even improved, as if the building itself is more welcoming to customers. But I still carry the silver bell, because sometimes late at night when I'm closing the shop, I notice things. Small things. A watch hand that hesitates for just a moment too long between seconds. A coin that feels slightly warmer than it should. Shadows that seem to move independently of their sources. And sometimes, when the afternoon light hits the clocks just right, I can see them. Ghostly hands moving backward through the air, occupying the same space as the real hands but following their own reverse timeline. They're faint, nearly transparent, like double-exposed photographs or memories that won't quite fade. I've learned to live with these reminders. They're manageable now, contained, held in check by whatever the bells accomplished that afternoon. But I understand what Carlos meant about underlying conditions. The building remembers its purpose, just as the clocks remember their backward dance. The question that keeps me awake isn't whether the phenomena were real. The evidence was too consistent, too witnessed, too documented to dismiss as mere delusion. The question is whether they were ever really gone, or if I've simply learned to coexist with them, to accept a reality where time doesn't always move in the direction it should. Sometimes I catch myself reaching for the silver bell when a clock's tick seems to stutter, when a reflection moves slightly out of sync with its source, when the afternoon light creates shadows that shouldn't exist. I haven't rung it yet. The temptation to test its power is balanced by the fear of what that test might unleash. But I keep it close, a talisman against temporal disturbance, a reminder that some problems can be managed but never truly solved. And every day at 5:17, I watch the clocks, just to be sure, just to be ready. Because in a building that once prepared the dead for eternity, time itself might not follow the rules I've spent my life learning to trust. And if those ghostly hands ever stop being transparent, if they ever become solid enough to move their clocks again, I want to be prepared. The bell rests in my pocket, warm against my palm, waiting for the moment when temporal realignment might once again become necessary. That moment may never come, but then again, in a place where the dead once rested and time moves in directions that physics can't explain, never might be just another word whose meaning has been quietly, permanently changed. Story 7. First thing that should have warned me was the silence. Not the peaceful quiet you'd expect from a mountain cabin nestled in the Aparatos da Serra, but something deeper, an absence that seemed to swallow sound before it could fully form. Even our footsteps on the wooden porch felt muffled, as if the air itself had grown thick and reluctant to carry vibrations. Marcus had found this place through some obscure rental website, boasting about scoring a deal on a rustic retreat for our much-needed weekend away from the suffocating routine of our corporate lives. The photos online had shown weathered timber walls and panoramic views of the canyon, but they hadn't captured the way shadows seemed to pool in the corners even during daylight, or how the windows reflected our faces back at us like dark mirrors, making us look like strangers to ourselves. The cabinet stood in what the owner had generously called the living room, a space dominated by a stone fireplace that hadn't seen flames in years, and furniture that belonged to a different decade. It was impossible to miss, positioned against the far wall like some ancient sentinel. The wood was dark with age, carved with intricate patterns that hurt to look at directly. The symbols seemed to shift when I wasn't focusing on them, writhing in my peripheral vision like living things. Tommy, always the skeptic, approached it first while Marcus and I unpacked our bags. He ran his fingers along the carved surface, tracing the incomprehensible patterns, with the fascination of someone who'd never learned to fear the unknown. "Check this out," he called, though his voice carried less enthusiasm than his words suggested. "These markings, I've never seen anything like them." I watched from across the room as he tried the handles. The cabinet shuddered, a barely perceptible tremor that seemed to travel through the floorboards and up into my bones. Tommy jerked his hands back as if burned, though when I asked if he was all right, he insisted nothing had happened. That first night, I lay in the narrow bed listening to the cabin settle around us. Every creak of timber, every whisper of wind through the eaves felt amplified in the darkness. But underneath these familiar sounds was something else. A rhythm so faint I convinced myself I was imagining it, like breathing or a heartbeat. The temperature dropped with each passing hour, despite the mild autumn weather outside. Marcus complained about the broken heating system, but when we checked the thermostat, it registered a comfortable 72 degrees. The cold seemed to radiate from specific points in the cabin, creating pockets of frigid air that made no meteorological sense. The worst spot was near the cabinet. I discovered this the next morning when I wandered into the living room with my coffee, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't name. The closer I got to the carved monstrosity, the more my breath began to mist. By the time I stood directly in front of it, I could see the vapor streaming from my mouth in small, panicked puffs. The symbols seemed more active in the early light filtering through the windows. They writhed and twisted, forming patterns that almost made sense, hieroglyphs on the verge of meaning, just beyond the reach of understanding. I found myself leaning closer, squinting at the intricate designs, when the cabinet began to vibrate. It started as a barely perceptible tremor, like a phone set to silent mode, but the sensation grew stronger, more insistent, until the entire piece of furniture seemed to pulse with some inner urgency. The vibration traveled through the floor and into my feet, my legs, my chest, until my whole body resonated with whatever force was trapped inside. Something was in there, something that wanted out. I stumbled backward, coffee spilling across my shirt, and the vibration stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, pregnant with potential energy. For several long minutes, I stood there staring at the cabinet, waiting for it to move again, but it remained stubbornly inanimate. When I told my friends about the incident over breakfast, they exchanged the kind of look people share when someone they care about is clearly losing their grip on reality. Marcus suggested I might be dehydrated. Tommy wondered aloud if the altitude was affecting me. Their concern felt genuine, but underneath it was something else. A growing distance, as if they were already preparing to protect themselves from whatever breakdown I was heading toward. The second night was worse. I woke to find my room significantly colder than it had been when I'd gone to sleep. My breath formed clouds in the darkness, and when I pulled the blankets tighter around my shoulders, I realized they felt damp with a moisture that hadn't been there hours before. The digital clock on the nightstand read 3:17 a.m., its red numerals the only source of light in the absolute darkness. Something had changed in the cabin's atmosphere. The oppressive silence had given way to subtle sounds. Not quite footsteps, but a rhythmic creaking that suggested movement. Someone, or something, was walking through the main room. I lay frozen in bed, straining to identify the source of the sound. The footsteps, if that's what they were, seemed to circle the living room in a deliberate pattern, around and around, never pausing, never varying in rhythm. After what felt like hours, they stopped directly outside my bedroom door. The silence that followed was absolute. I waited, counting my heartbeats, for the door handle to turn or for whatever was out there to announce its presence. But nothing happened. No sound, no movement, just the weight of something standing on the other side of the thin wooden door, waiting with infinite patience for me to make the first move. When morning finally came, I found my friends already awake and huddled around the kitchen table with expressions that suggested they hadn't slept much either. Marcus looked pale and drawn, dark circles shadowing his eyes. Tommy kept glancing toward the living room as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. Neither of them mentioned hearing footsteps, but the way they avoided eye contact told me they'd experienced something equally unsettling. We ate breakfast in relative silence, each of us lost in our own troubled thoughts, until Tommy finally voiced what we were all thinking. The cabinet had been moved. Not far, maybe 6 inches from its original position, but enough to leave marks on the dusty floor where its base had rested. The carved symbols seemed more pronounced in the morning light, deeper and more complex than they'd appeared before, and the temperature around it had dropped even further, creating a zone of bitter cold that made approaching it physically uncomfortable. But the most disturbing change was what happened when we tried to open it. The handles, which had been stuck fast since our arrival, now turned easily. Too easily, as if whatever mechanism had held them closed no longer had any interest in keeping us out. The doors swung open with a whisper of hinges that sounded almost like relief. Inside, there was nothing but darkness. Not the expected darkness of an enclosed space, but something deeper and more substantial. The shadows within the cabinet seemed to move independently of any light source, writhing and coiling like smoke given form. They spilled outward in tendrils that shouldn't have been possible, reaching toward us with what could only be described as hunger. I slammed the doors shut before those shadow fingers could touch any of us, but the image remained burned into my retinas. Darkness that behaved like a living thing, pressing against the inner walls of the cabinet like a caged animal testing the strength of its prison. That afternoon, Tommy suggested we investigate the cabinet's foundation. Something about the way it sat on the floor had been bothering him, he said, though he couldn't articulate exactly what. We pried up the floorboards around its base, expecting to find standard support beams or maybe evidence of water damage. Instead, we found roots. Thick, twisted things that bore no resemblance to any tree or plant I knew. They emerged from the soil beneath the cabin like gnarled fingers, wrapping around the cabinet's base and disappearing up into its interior. The wood of the cabinet itself seemed to merge seamlessly with these organic growths, as if the furniture had grown rather than been built. The roots pulsed with a slow, steady rhythm that reminded me uncomfortably of a heartbeat. And they were warm, not just warm, but actively hot to the touch, radiating heat that seemed to increase whenever one of us drew near. It was then that I realized where the cold in the cabin was coming from. The roots were feeding. Every time we approached the cabinet, every time we stood within its sphere of influence, the organic tendrils absorbed heat from our bodies. Not just the ambient warmth of our skin, but something deeper. The fundamental energy that kept us alive and functioning. The more time we spent near it, the more drained we felt, as if something was slowly sipping away our life force. The question now was what to do about it. Tommy advocated for burning the entire thing, cabinet and roots together. Fire would cleanse whatever malevolent presence had taken up residence in our rented sanctuary, he argued, though his voice lacked conviction. Marcus preferred the idea of reburying it, covering the roots with soil and pretending we'd never discovered them. Both options felt equally dangerous in ways I couldn't fully articulate. Burning it might free whatever was trapped inside, something that had clearly been feeding and growing stronger during our stay. But burying it again felt like condemning future visitors to the same gradual drain of vitality we'd experienced, or worse. As we debated our options, the cabinet's vibrations grew stronger and more frequent. The shadows within it pressed harder against the doors, and the temperature around its base plummeted until frost began forming on the exposed roots. Whatever lived inside was becoming agitated, perhaps sensing that its feeding ground was about to be disrupted. That final night, none of us bothered pretending we might sleep. We huddled in the kitchen with every light in the cabin blazing, taking turns keeping watch while the others dozed fitfully in their chairs. The sounds from the living room had evolved beyond simple footsteps into something more complex. A symphony of creaks and whispers that suggested the cabinet was no longer content to wait passively for our approach. The roots beneath the floorboards pulsed faster now, their rhythm matching my elevated heart rate. The connection between the thing in the cabinet and my own physiology was becoming impossible to ignore. It was learning from us, adapting to our presence, growing stronger with each hour we remained within its influence. As dawn approached, I made my decision. I would neither burn nor bury the cabinet. Instead, I would open it one final time and confront whatever lurked within those impossible shadows. The others tried to dissuade me, but their protests felt distant and unimportant. Something in the back of my mind whispered that this had always been inevitable, that the cabinet had been waiting specifically for me, and that our entire weekend had been orchestrated to bring us to this moment. I approached the cabinet as morning light streamed through the windows, casting long shadows that seemed to bend toward the carved monstrosity rather than away from it. The symbols on its surface writhed with increased activity, forming patterns that almost looked like faces, distorted visages, caught in expressions of hunger and anticipation. The handles turned in my hands with no resistance. The doors swung open, revealing the familiar wall of living darkness within. But this time, instead of recoiling, I stepped forward and reached into the shadows. The cold that engulfed my hand was beyond description, not merely the absence of heat, but something actively hostile to warmth, to life, to the basic physical laws that governed normal existence. The darkness wrapped around my arm like liquid, pulling me deeper into its embrace with a strength that belonged to something much larger than the cabinet could possibly contain. And in that moment of contact, I understood. The cabinet was not a prison. It was a doorway. The thing inside was not trapped. It was waiting. And it had been calling to me since the moment we'd arrived, drawing me closer with promises I couldn't quite remember making. The roots beneath the floor were not feeding on our heat. They were preparing us, changing us, making us suitable for whatever lay beyond the threshold of shadows. I tried to pull back, but the darkness held firm. It began to spread up my arm, across my shoulder, toward my chest. Where it touched, my skin grew numb and then disappeared entirely, replaced by the same impossible void that filled the cabinet's interior. The last thing I remember clearly was the sound of my friends calling my name from what seemed like a great distance. Their voices were filled with panic and confusion, but underneath that was something else: relief, as if they were finally free of whatever influence had been pressing down on all of us since our arrival. But that memory feels uncertain now, like something I might have dreamed or invented to make sense of what happened next. Because what I remember next is standing in the kitchen with Marcus and Tommy, all three of us staring at the empty space where the cabinet had been. The floorboards were intact, unmarked by any evidence of our excavation. The temperature in the cabin was comfortable and even throughout. When I asked about the cabinet, about the roots, about the shadows, my friends looked at me with the kind of careful concern reserved for people who are clearly having some kind of breakdown. They gently explained that there had never been any cabinet. The rental photos they showed me on Marcus's phone displayed the same living room we stood in now, sparsely furnished but unremarkable, with nothing but empty wall space where I remembered the carved monstrosity standing. The medical explanation is stress-induced hallucinations brought on by overwork and exhaustion. The psychiatrist I saw after returning home was very understanding about the pressures of modern life and how they can manifest in unusual ways. The medication helps mostly, though I still sometimes wake up in the middle of the night convinced I can hear that rhythmic pulsing just beneath the threshold of consciousness. My friends remain supportive but distant, the way people are with someone they care about but can no longer fully trust. They check on me regularly, always asking if I'm taking my medication, always watching for signs that I might be slipping back into whatever delusion consumed me during our weekend away. But sometimes, when I'm alone in my apartment and the shadows in the corners seem a little too deep, I wonder if the cabinet was ever the prison I thought it was. Sometimes I think about those impossible roots, still pulsing somewhere beneath perception, still feeding on something essential that I can no longer quite identify. And sometimes late at night, when the medication wears thin, I find myself standing in front of my own closet, my hand hovering over the handle, listening for vibrations that might or might not be there. The rational part of my mind insists that what's inside is nothing more than clothes and boxes and the detritus of ordinary life. But the other part, the part that remembers the feeling of darkness wrapping around my arm like a welcoming embrace, knows better. The question that haunts me most is not whether the cabinet was real. The question is whether I ever actually left it behind. Story 8. The first time I heard it, I convinced myself it was just another bird call lost in the symphony of the Pantanal. 3 notes, sharp and clean, cutting through the humid air like a blade through silk. I was crouched beside a caiman nest, carefully measuring eggs, when that whistle pierced the dawn quiet. My hand froze mid-motion, the calipers trembling slightly, as something primal in my chest recognized a sound that didn't belong. Dr. Martinez had warned me about the isolation when I accepted the research position at Estação Buriti. 6 months alone in the wetlands, documenting breeding patterns and ecological changes in one of the world's most biodiverse regions. The pay was generous, the scientific opportunity invaluable, and after the divorce, solitude felt like medicine rather than punishment. I thought I understood what isolation meant. I was wrong. The station sat on a small island of higher ground, surrounded by seasonal floodplains that stretched toward distant mountains like a green ocean. Buriti palms rose from the landscape like ancient sentinels, their fan-shaped crowns rustling secrets in languages older than human speech. During my first week, their constant whisper became a comforting backdrop to my work. By the second week, I began to suspect they were watching me. It started as a peripheral awareness, the way your skin prickles when someone stares at you across a crowded room. I'd be cataloging plant specimens or checking water pH levels, and the sensation would creep up my spine like cold fingers. When I'd turn to look, there would be nothing but the endless ranks of palms, their fronds moving in whatever breeze I couldn't feel. The cattle appeared on a Tuesday morning in late March. I spotted them from the station's observation deck, a small herd of zebu wandering through the shallows about half a kilometer south. They moved strangely, clustering together in a tight group rather than spreading out to graze. Through my binoculars, I could see they belonged to one of the neighboring ranches. The brand was clearly visible on their flanks. But there was something else marked on their hides. Perfect circles, each about the size of a dinner plate, seared into their brown coats with surgical precision. The marks looked fresh, the hair around the edges singed and standing at odd angles. No tool I knew could create such clean cauterization, and certainly no predator. Yet there they were, 3 perfect rings burned into living flesh, the cattle seemingly unbothered by what should have been agonizing wounds. I radioed the findings to Dr. Martinez back in Cuiabá, describing the markings as thoroughly as possible. His response crackled through the static. Cattle sometimes sustained injuries from lightning strikes during storms, and circular burns weren't unheard of in areas with high electrical activity. The explanation felt reasonable, scientific, grounding. Lightning could indeed create strange patterns on exposed skin, but lightning didn't whistle. The 3-note call came again that evening, just as purple clouds began building on the western horizon. This time I was ready, my digital recorder in hand as I stepped onto the deck. The first drops of rain had begun to fall, fat and warm against my arms, when the sound pierced the growing darkness. 3 notes, clean, sharp, deliberate. Not random like a bird call, but purposeful, measured. I hit record and stood motionless, barely breathing, waiting for it to repeat. The storm that followed was unlike anything I'd experienced in the Pantanal. Lightning didn't flash. It writhed across the sky in continuous serpentine patterns, turning the world into a strobing photograph. Thunder rolled without pause, a constant percussion that seemed to come from beneath the earth rather than above. And through it all, that whistle echoed across the wetlands, always in groups of 3, always perfectly timed with the lightning's brightest moments. I recorded for 2 hours, my clothes soaked through, my hair plastered to my skull, driven by a compulsion I couldn't name. The sound was calling to something deep in my brain, activating circuits that predated language and logic. When the storm finally moved on, leaving behind the clean smell of ozone and wet earth, I had nearly 4 gigabytes of audio data. The next morning, I fed the recordings into my laptop's spectral analysis software. What I saw in the resulting graphs made my coffee cup slip from nerveless fingers. The whistles weren't random animal vocalizations. They formed patterns. Complex, structured, repetitive patterns that looked suspiciously like language. More disturbing still, when I isolated and enhanced the clearest segments, a word emerged from the digital noise. A single word, repeated with mechanical precision throughout the storm. Saia. Portuguese. Leave. Get out. My hands shook as I ran the analysis again, adjusting parameters, checking for equipment malfunction. The result remained the same. Something in the Pantanal was speaking Portuguese, commanding me to leave in a voice that rode lightning and hid among the Buriti palms. I spent the next 3 days reviewing every piece of equipment, testing microphones, calibrating software. The rational part of my mind insisted there had to be an explanation. Interference from radio transmissions, acoustic anomalies created by the storm, some form of auditory pareidolia where my brain imposed meaning on random sounds. But the pattern was too clear, too consistent, and it was always the same word. Saya. Sleep became elusive. I'd lie in my narrow bunk, listening to the wetlands' nocturnal chorus, waiting for those 3 notes to cut through the darkness. They never came at night, only during storms, only in daylight. But knowing they would return made every moment of silence feel like held breath. The dream started on the 5th night after the first recording. I found myself standing waist-deep in murky water, surrounded by buriti palms that stretched impossibly tall into a sky the color of old brass. The water was warm, body temperature, and moved around my legs with a subtle current that felt almost like breathing. In the distance, barely visible through the palm fronds, a figure stood motionless. It was human-shaped, but wrong in ways my sleeping mind couldn't quite catalog. Too tall, perhaps, or too thin. Its arms hung at unnatural angles, and something in its posture suggested joints that bent in directions human joints shouldn't. But it was the sound that filled me with dread. A low, rhythmic breathing that came not from lungs, but from something hollow being blown across, like wind through a cave mouth. The figure raised one impossibly long arm to its face, and I realized it held something against its lips. A tube of some kind, pale and smooth. As I watched, paralyzed by dream logic, it drew a deep breath and released that familiar 3-note whistle. The sound hit me like a physical force, rippling through the water, shaking the palm fronds, resonating in my bones. And with perfect dream clarity, I understood that the tube wasn't carved from wood or metal. It was bone, a hollow, yellowed bone worn smooth by countless hands and endless use. Saya, the whistle said without words. Saya, Saya, Saya. I woke gasping, my sleeping bag soaked with sweat, the taste of swamp water thick on my tongue. But the most disturbing part wasn't the dream itself. It was the knowledge that had come with it. In that otherworldly space between sleep and waking, I had understood something fundamental about the sound, about its purpose and origin. It wasn't trying to drive me away, it was calling me home. The realization should have been comforting, but instead it filled me with a terror so profound I couldn't name its source. I stumbled to the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face, staring at my reflection in the small mirror. My eyes looked different, wider somehow, with pupils that seemed to hold more darkness than they should. And when I opened my mouth to rinse away the phantom taste of marsh water, I could swear my teeth looked sharper than I remembered. Days blurred together after that. I maintained my research routine with mechanical precision, but my focus had shifted. Instead of studying the wetland's documented inhabitants, I found myself searching for signs of the Whistler. I set up additional recording equipment around the island, creating a network of microphones that could triangulate sound sources. I mapped the locations where I'd seen the marked cattle, looking for patterns in their movements. I analyzed soil samples for unusual magnetic properties that might explain the perfect circular burns. The dreams came every night now, growing more vivid and detailed. The figure in the marsh became clearer with each visit, though clarity only made it more disturbing. Its skin had the gray-green pallor of stagnant water, with patches that seemed to shift and flow like liquid. Its eyes were the worst part, not because they were monstrous, but because they were utterly familiar. They held the same expression I'd seen in my bathroom mirror, the same mixture of longing and terror that filled my waking hours. And always, that bone whistle. I could see it clearly now, a femur, perhaps human, though larger than any human bone should be. Holes had been drilled near one end with perfect precision, and the entire surface was covered in carved symbols that writhed and shifted when I tried to focus on them. The figure would raise it to lips that were too wide, too flexible, and blow those 3 notes that I'd begun to hear even when awake. On the 12th night, the dream changed. Instead of standing in the marsh, I found myself walking through it, moving toward the figure with deliberate steps. The water grew deeper as I approached, rising from my waist to my chest to my neck, but I felt no fear of drowning. My lungs seemed perfectly capable of processing the thick, mineral-rich liquid. Small fish swam between my fingers, and aquatic plants wrapped around my ankles like welcoming hands. The figure waited until I was close enough to see the intricate carvings on the bone, close enough to smell the rich organic scent of decomposition and new growth that surrounded it like perfume. When it spoke, its voice was the sound of wind through reeds, of water lapping against muddy banks, of life and death cycling endlessly through the wetlands. "You hear the call," it said, and though its lips moved strangely around the words, I understood perfectly. "What are you?" I asked, surprised to find my dream voice steady. "What you're becoming." It gestured to the bone whistle with one elongated finger. "What we all become eventually. The marsh takes everything and makes it part of itself. Your kind just takes longer to understand." "I'm not," I began, but stopped as I looked down at my hands. They were changing, the fingers stretching, the skin taking on that same gray-green pallor. Webs of tissue stretched between my digits, and I could feel gills opening along my throat. "The cattle understood," the figure continued. "The marks you found, they're not burns. They're invitations. Transformation begins with the willing." I tried to step backward, but my feet had sunk into the marsh bottom, and roots or vines wrapped around my ankles. Panic rose in my throat, but when I opened my mouth to scream, only that three-note whistle emerged. I woke to find myself standing on the station's deck, my bare feet wet with morning dew. The recording equipment I'd set up around the perimeter was beeping steadily, motion sensors triggered, microphones active, data streaming into storage drives. But I had no memory of leaving my bed, no recollection of stepping outside. The morning sun cast long shadows across the wetlands, and in those shadows I could see shapes that might have been debris or fallen logs, or figures standing motionless among the buriti palms, waiting for something I was only beginning to understand. I checked the overnight recordings with trembling hands. The files showed exactly what I expected, and exactly what I feared. Hours of audio filled with that familiar three-note whistle, but the timestamp showed the sounds had been recorded from inside the station, from my bedroom. The source of the whistling was me. I'd been sleep-talking in a language I didn't recognize, producing sounds no human throat should be able to make. But more than that, when I analyzed the frequency patterns, they matched perfectly with the storm recordings from 2 weeks earlier. I was calling back to something in the marsh, responding to an invitation I'd been too afraid to acknowledge. The final recording was the most disturbing. In the pre-dawn darkness, my voice had begun to change, growing deeper and more resonant. The Portuguese word "ceia" transformed gradually into something else, a series of clicking, hissing sounds that seemed to come from somewhere much deeper than vocal cords. And underneath it all, barely audible but unmistakably present, was the sound of breathing. Not human breathing, but the rhythmic susurrus of air moving through something hollow. I should have left then, should have packed my equipment, radioed for extraction, and never looked back at the buriti palms and their secretive whispers. Every rational instinct screamed that I was losing my grip on reality, that isolation and stress had created an elaborate delusion that grew more convincing with each passing day. But rational thought felt increasingly foreign, like trying to remember a language I'd once spoken fluently, but had somehow forgotten. The marsh was calling, and my body was answering in ways my mind couldn't control. My skin had begun to feel too dry. My lungs struggled with air that seemed increasingly thin and unsatisfying. The water I drank tasted flat and lifeless compared to the rich, mineral-heavy liquid I sampled from the wetlands during my daily tests. And the dreams were no longer confined to sleep. Standing in the laboratory that afternoon, analyzing water samples under the microscope, I suddenly found myself hip-deep in warm marsh water. The sensation lasted only seconds, but I could feel the gentle current against my legs, could smell the rich organic decay that spoke of endless cycles of death and rebirth. When the vision faded, I was left staring at my own reflection in the microscope's viewing lens, and for just a moment, My eyes had held that familiar gray-green depth. The truth was becoming undeniable, though my fragmenting rationality fought against accepting it. The sounds, the dreams, the gradual changes in my body, they weren't symptoms of psychological breakdown. They were transformation. The marsh wasn't trying to drive me away or destroy me. It was welcoming me home to a place I'd never been but somehow always belonged. That night, I made no attempt to sleep in my bed. Instead, I walked to the edge of the island and sat with my feet in the water, waiting for the next storm to build on the horizon. The cattle had wandered closer, their circular marks clearly visible in the moonlight. Not burns, as I'd first thought, but gills. Perfect, functional gills that allowed them to process oxygen from water as easily as air. They watched me with eyes that held the same depth mine were developing, and I understood that they were no longer entirely cattle, just as I was no longer entirely human. The marsh changed everything it touched, not through violence or conquest, but through a patient love that accepted all offerings and gave back something greater than what it took. When the storm finally arrived, I didn't run for shelter. I stood waist-deep in the warm water as lightning painted the sky in brilliant networks, and when that three-note whistle echoed across the wetlands, I whistled back. My response came naturally, without conscious thought, as if I'd always known the proper reply to that ancient greeting. The figure emerged from the deeper water with slow, graceful movements, no longer a source of terror, but of recognition. As it approached, I could see the bone whistle clearly, not a tool of summoning, but an instrument of communication, carved from the willing gift of someone who had completed their transformation long ago. "Are you ready?" it asked, and its voice was no longer alien, but familiar as my own heartbeat. I looked back toward the research station, at the life I'd built around the illusion of separation between human and nature, observer and observed. The equipment I'd used to study the marsh as if it were something separate from myself sat silently in the darkness, recording nothing now but my absence. When I turned back to the figure, I was no longer afraid of what I was becoming. The marsh had been patient, allowing me to choose, but the choice had always been inevitable. I had come here thinking I was studying nature, but nature had been studying me in return, determining my suitability for a transformation I hadn't known I needed. I took the bone whistle in hands that were finally changing into something more suited for this environment, and raised it to lips that could produce sounds human vocal cords had never evolved to make. The first note came easily, pure and clean, carrying across the water with perfect clarity. The second note harmonized with sounds from deeper in the marsh, where others like us waited in patient communion with the ecosystem that had claimed and transformed them. The third note was answered by the storm itself, lightning responding to our call with patterns that revealed the true language of this place, older than Portuguese, older than any human tongue, written in water and wind, and the endless cycling of life through death into new life. I don't know if Dr. Martinez will send a search team when my weekly reports stop coming. I don't know if they'll find the research station empty, my equipment abandoned, my clothes folded neatly on the deck as if I'd simply walked into the water and disappeared. But if they do come looking, if they bring their boats and their radios and their rational explanations for my disappearance, I hope they'll be wise enough to leave when they hear the whistle. 3 notes, clean and sharp, carrying across the wetlands like a blade through silk. Some calls aren't meant to be answered by those who aren't ready to come home. Story 9. The barn loomed against the October sky like a wound in the darkness, its weathered boards catching what little moonlight filtered through the cloud cover. I hadn't been back to the family property in 3 years, not since Dad's funeral, but the pull of unfinished work had finally drawn me here. The barn owls needed documenting before winter drove them elsewhere, and this decrepit structure had always been their favored roost. My boots crunched through brittle leaves as I approached the entrance, camera bag slung over my shoulder. The familiar weight of my Canon and telephoto lens provided comfort in the oppressive stillness. Even the insects seemed muted here, as if the very air absorbed sound before it could travel far. The heavy wooden door groaned on rusted hinges, releasing the musty scent of decades-old hay and something else. something damp and organic that made my sinuses burn. I clicked on my flashlight, its LED beam cutting through the murky interior. Dust motes danced in the light like tiny spirits, and somewhere in the rafters above, I caught the soft shuffle of feathers. Perfect. They were here. I spent the first hour setting up my equipment, adjusting the tripod and testing different angles. The owls remained elusive, their white forms ghosting between the wooden beams like fragments of moon-pale cloth. Every time I thought I had a clear shot, they'd vanish into shadows that seemed deeper than they should be in a structure this size. The temperature had dropped noticeably since I'd entered. My breath began forming small clouds in the flashlight's glow, and I found myself shivering despite my heavy jacket. The cold seemed to seep up from the floorboards themselves, as if the earth below had turned to ice. That's when I heard it, a soft creaking from the second floor. Not the settling of old wood, but something rhythmic, deliberate. I killed the flashlight and waited in the absolute darkness, listening. The sound stopped immediately, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like pressure against my eardrums. But gradually my eyes began to adjust, and I noticed something that made my chest tighten. A pale, diffused glow emanated from somewhere above. Not bright, barely visible really, but unmistakably there. It pulsed faintly, like a dying fluorescent bulb struggling to maintain its charge. The logical part of my mind cataloged possibilities, reflected light from a passing car, though the main road was miles away. Bioluminescent fungi, though I'd never heard of any native to this region. Maybe old electrical wiring still receiving intermittent power, though the farm had been disconnected from the grid for over a decade. But logic felt flimsy in this place where shadows moved independently of their sources, and the air tasted of copper and decay. I found the ladder to the second floor exactly where I remembered it, though the rungs felt somehow different under my hands, smoother, as if worn by frequent use. Each step upward brought the strange glow into sharper focus, revealing its source as a corner of the upper level that had always been used for storage. The smell grew stronger as I climbed. Not just dampness now, but something sweetly corrupt, like fruit left to rot in warm water. My stomach churned, but curiosity overrode revulsion. I'd come here to capture images, and every instinct told me that whatever waited above would be unlike anything I'd photographed before. The second floor stretched before me in the weak light, cluttered with the detritus of abandoned farming, broken equipment, moldy feed sacks, tangles of rusted wire. But in the far corner, illuminated by that impossible glow, stood a figure that shouldn't exist. It was a scarecrow, but wrong in every conceivable way. Where most scarecrows were crude assemblages of straw and cloth, this one appeared deliberately crafted. Its clothing, if the dark, sodden material could be called clothing, clung to its frame like a second skin. The fabric seemed to move independently, rippling with an internal current that had nothing to do with air circulation. But it was the face that stopped my breath entirely, or rather, the absence where a face should be. The head was wrapped in the same wet cloth, but where a mouth should have been, there was only smooth material, as if the feature had never been intended or had been deliberately erased. And in its hands that appeared too articulated for straw and wire, it held my camera. Not a camera like mine. My camera. The same Canon I'd been using 3 years ago during my last visit, the one that had vanished from my car while I'd slept in town. I could see the distinctive scratches on the body, the slightly dented filter ring where I'd once dropped it on concrete. Even the custom strap was there, frayed in the exact places I remembered. The scarecrow stood motionless, but I had the unshakable sensation that it was looking at me through that mouthless, eyeless face, looking and evaluating and finding me somehow wanting. I don't remember making the decision to approach. One moment I was frozen in the ladder's entrance, and the next I was walking across the creaking floorboards, my current camera raised almost defensively in front of me. The glow seemed to intensify as I drew closer, though its source remained maddeningly unclear. When I was perhaps 6 feet away, I stopped and raised my camera. Through the viewfinder, the scarecrow appeared even more wrong, the proportions subtly off. the wet cloth seeming to pulse with a life of its own. I pressed the shutter. The flash fired, brilliant and harsh in the enclosed space. For an instant, everything was bleached white, and in that moment of overexposure, I could have sworn I saw something behind the scarecrow's featureless face. Not features exactly, but an awareness, a recognition. When my vision cleared, the scarecrow remained exactly as before, but my stolen camera now hung at a slightly different angle, as if it had been shifted during that blazing moment of illumination. I checked the LCD screen on my camera, scrolling to the image I'd just captured. The photo showed the corner of the barn, dusty and cluttered with old equipment. No scarecrow, no mysterious glow, just empty space and shadows. A chill that had nothing to do with temperature crawled up my spine. I looked up from the camera to confirm what I was seeing, and the scarecrow was still there, still holding my missing equipment, still exuding that sense of patient malevolence. I took another photo. Same result. An empty corner captured in digital clarity. And another. The third image was identical to the first two, but when I looked more closely at the screen, I noticed something that made my hands begin to shake. In the background of the shot, barely visible among the scattered equipment, was a pale shape. Roughly humanoid, but indistinct. It could have been a trick of light and shadow, a pareidolia effect where the mind imposes patterns on random visual noise, except it hadn't been there in the previous photos. I forced myself to take a fourth shot, then immediately checked the result. The pale shape had moved closer to the camera's position, not dramatically, perhaps a few feet, but unmistakably closer. And while it remained blurred and indefinite, its posture suggested purpose, intent. The scarecrow before me hadn't moved. I was certain of that. It stood in exactly the same position, maintaining that awful, eyeless regard. But somehow, in the space between the camera's electronic captures, it was also moving through a parallel version of the barn. A version that existed only in those frozen moments when light struck the sensor and reality crystallized into pixels. I should have left then. Every rational thought screamed at me to retreat down the ladder and drive away as fast as my car could manage. But something stronger than reason compelled me to continue. Maybe it was professional curiosity, or maybe it was something darker. A need to understand what was happening, even if understanding came at a cost I couldn't yet comprehend. I took a fifth photo. The figure in the image had advanced again, this time close enough that details were becoming visible. It moved with an unnatural gait, as if unfamiliar with the mechanics of locomotion. Its arms hung at odd angles, and what I had initially taken for clothing now looked more like strips of wet fabric wrapped around a frame that might not be entirely solid. Sixth photo. Closer still. I could now make out the suggestion of a head, though it appeared to be wrapped or covered in the same material that clothed the rest of the figure. There was something wrong with the proportions. The limbs too long, the torso too narrow, the head tilted at an angle that would be impossible for any living neck to maintain. By the seventh photo, the figure occupied the center of the frame, and I realized with mounting horror that it was approaching the camera's position. Not the physical camera in my hands, but the perspective from which the photos were being taken. It was moving through a version of the barn that existed only in those captured moments, getting closer to a viewpoint that corresponded exactly to where I stood. I found myself backing toward the ladder, though the scarecrow before me remained motionless. The disconnect between what I saw with my eyes and what the camera revealed was becoming unbearable. Reality seemed to be fracturing, splitting into parallel streams that occasionally intersected in ways that threatened my grip on sanity. Eighth photo. The figure now dominated the frame, close enough that I could see it was definitely constructed from the same wet, dark material as the scarecrow. But where the physical scarecrow was static, this photographic version moved with fluid purpose. Its wrapped head was turned directly toward the camera's position, and though I couldn't see features through the cloth, I felt the weight of its attention like a physical presence. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely operate the camera controls, but I forced myself to take a ninth shot. The figure was now just out of arm's reach in the photograph, close enough that I could see the texture of the wet fabric that comprised its form. The material wasn't cloth at all, I realized, but something organic. It glistened with moisture that might have been water, or might have been something far worse. And behind the figure, in the background of the photograph, I could see my own missing camera. It hung from the scarecrow's hands, its lens pointed directly at the photographic viewpoint. In the captured image, my stolen camera was taking a picture of me taking a picture of the approaching figure, an infinite recursion of observation and recording, each layer nested within the next like Russian dolls made of light and time and mounting terror. I knew I shouldn't take a 10th photo. Some instinct deeper than thought warned me that whatever was happening would reach a critical threshold if I pressed the shutter again. The figure was too close now, existing in a space that was almost but not quite the same as the physical location where I stood. But my finger moved independently of my will, pressing down on the shutter release with the mechanical precision of long practice. The flash fired. When I looked at the LCD screen, the photo showed an empty barn from my exact vantage point. No equipment, no scarecrow, no approaching figure, just bare wooden floors and walls, as if the structure had been cleaned and abandoned decades ago. But superimposed over this stark emptiness, almost transparent but unmistakably present, was my own face. I was looking back at myself through the camera's lens, my expression frozen in a moment of absolute terror. I was in the photograph, but I was also holding the camera that took the photograph, which meant something else was operating the shutter. The scarecrow before me remained exactly as it had been, clutching my missing camera in hands that shouldn't exist. But now I understood that what I was seeing was only one layer of a more complex reality. In the spaces between the frames, in the gaps between captured moments, other versions of this scene were playing out according to rules I couldn't comprehend. I turned and ran for the ladder, no longer caring about documentation or understanding. Behind me, I heard no pursuit, but that absence of sound was worse than any threatening noise could have been. It suggested patience. It suggested that whatever was happening here operated on timescales that made human urgency irrelevant. I reached my car and drove away without looking back, though I felt the weight of observation following me for miles. It wasn't until I was back in town, parked under the harsh fluorescence of a 24-hour gas station, that I allowed myself to examine the camera's memory card. Every photo I'd taken in the barn was there, exactly as I remembered them. The progression of the approaching figure, the gradual increase in detail and proximity, the final image of my own terrified face staring back from an empty room. But there was one additional photograph, one I didn't remember taking. It showed the interior of my car from the passenger seat perspective. I was behind the wheel, staring ahead with the intense concentration of someone fleeing. The timestamp indicated it had been captured while I was driving away from the farm. In the rearview mirror visible in the photograph, something pale and indistinct sat in the back seat. I spun around to check the actual back seat of my car. Empty, of course, nothing but old fast food containers and photography equipment. But when I looked back at the camera's LCD screen, the image remained, and in the reflection caught in the car's rear window, the pale figure was raising what appeared to be a camera of its own. I haven't been back to the farm. I've tried to convince myself that what happened was some form of breakdown, a psychological response to returning to a place associated with loss and childhood memories. The rational explanation is that I experienced a series of hallucinations triggered by stress and the suggestive atmosphere of the abandoned barn. But every time I use my camera now, I find myself checking each photograph immediately after taking it, looking for signs that reality has fractured again, that something is moving through the spaces between frames. And sometimes, in photographs taken in perfectly normal locations, under perfectly normal circumstances, I catch glimpses of wet fabric in the background, never quite in focus, never quite identifiable, but unmistakably present. The figure is still approaching, frame by frame, moment by moment. It's getting closer to breaching whatever barrier separates its reality from mine. I've calculated that at its current rate of progression, it will reach me in approximately 47 more photographs. I've taken 39 since leaving the barn. Tonight, I'm going to put my camera away and never touch it again. I'm going to trust that without the mechanical intermediation of shutters and sensors, whatever haunts the spaces between captured moments will lose interest and fade back into whatever realm it inhabits. But even as I write this, I feel the urge to document the words themselves, to photograph this page, to capture this moment of decision and resolve. The camera sits on my desk, its lens cap removed, its battery fully charged. My finger hovers over the shutter release. 8 more photos until I learn what happens when the space between frames becomes no space at all. Story 10. The first thing you notice about silence is that it isn't silent at all. I've been a ranger in these Minas Gerais mountains for 12 years, long enough to know that the forest never truly sleeps. There's always something, the whisper of wind through quartzite formations, the distant crack of settling stone, the soft percussion of insects against bark. But that Tuesday morning in March, when I first heard about the circles, the silence felt different, expectant. Maria Santos had called the station just after dawn, her voice tight with something beyond the usual concern about illegal logging or poachers. The moss circles had appeared overnight in her backyard, she said, glowing faintly green in the pre-dawn darkness. Perfect rings, each about 3 feet across, sprouting from earth that had been barren clay the evening before. I drove out to the Santos property expecting some kind of bioluminescent fungus, unusual, but not unheard of in our humid climate. What I found instead made my skin crawl in ways I still can't adequately explain. The circles weren't just moss. They were intricate mandala patterns of different plant species, each ring containing varieties that shouldn't grow together, shouldn't survive in that soil, and definitely shouldn't emit that subtle, pulsing glow. Maria met me at her gate, her usual warm demeanor replaced by something skittish. She kept glancing over her shoulder toward the tree line as she led me around back. Her husband, Eduardo, stood near the largest circle, arms crossed, his face carrying the expression of a man trying to convince himself he wasn't seeing what he was seeing. The circles were beautiful and wrong in equal measure. The inner rings consisted of moss so vibrant it seemed artificial, surrounded by concentric bands of small flowering plants I couldn't identify. The outermost rings held tiny seedlings that looked ancient despite their size, their leaves bearing patterns that reminded me uncomfortably of the cave paintings I'd studied during my forestry degree. Eduardo told me about the voices. He'd heard his late father calling from the forest the night before, clear as day, asking him to come help with something urgent. The voice had been perfect. Inflection, accent, even the old man's chronic cough between words. Eduardo had been halfway to the tree line before he remembered his father had been dead for 3 years. Maria had heard her sister calling too, though her sister lived in São Paulo and hadn't visited in months. The voice had seemed to come from just beyond the largest circle, pleading for help with car trouble, asking her to bring a flashlight. I documented everything, took photographs, collected samples, standard procedure for unusual phenomena. But as I worked, I became aware of a sensation I couldn't shake, the feeling of being watched from the forest's edge. Every time I glanced up, I caught movement in my peripheral vision that vanished when I turned my head. Shadows that lingered a moment too long. Tree trunks that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. The Santos family wasn't the only one affected. By noon, I'd received calls from 3 other properties along the ridge. Same story, overnight circles, familiar voices calling from the woods, and a growing sense of unease that none of them could articulate properly. I spent the afternoon hiking the ridge trail, following the pattern of affected properties. The terrain here was rugged, scarred by centuries of small-scale mining operations, and the more recent intrusion of modern extraction techniques. It was near the old Esperanza mine that I found the connection I'd been subconsciously seeking. The sound reached me first, the mechanical groan of heavy machinery echoing off quartzite walls. I followed it to a ravine I'd thought inaccessible, now carved open by bulldozers and fitted with access roads. A mining operation in full swing, complete with trucks hauling away massive blocks of stone that had probably stood undisturbed for millennia. I approached the foreman, a sun-weathered man named Carlos, who seemed genuinely surprised to see a park ranger. His permits were in order, he assured me, though his eyes kept sliding away from mine as he spoke. The company had recently discovered this deposit after heavy rains exposed the ravine. They were extracting premium quartzite for construction projects in Belo Horizonte. Carlos led me to the extraction site, and that's when I saw them. The cave paintings were magnificent and disturbing, exposed now where the quartzite blocks had been removed. Ancient symbols covered the ravine walls, spirals, branching patterns, and humanoid figures that seemed to dance in the afternoon shadows. But what made my breath catch were the figures themselves. They weren't quite human. Their forms suggested people, but with features that branched and spread like root systems, arms that extended into intricate patterns reminiscent of bark texture. The painting showed these figures emerging from trees, their bodies transitioning seamlessly from wood to flesh. In some images, they appeared to be speaking to human figures. In others, they seemed to be merging with them. I asked Carlos how long the paintings had been exposed. 3 days, he said, though his timeline seemed uncertain. The first blocks had been removed Monday morning. The circles at the Santos property had appeared Tuesday night. I took more photographs, though the camera seemed to struggle with the lighting in the ravine. The images came out strangely blurred, as if something were interfering with the focus. The painted figures appeared to shift between shots, though I told myself it was just the changing angle of sunlight through the canyon. That evening, I researched the area's indigenous history. The Krenak people had inhabited these mountains for centuries before Portuguese colonization. Their oral traditions spoke of tree spirits, guardians who could take human form but were bound to the earth by ancient agreements. According to the stories, these spirits could be helpful or harmful depending on how they were treated, but they should never be disturbed in their resting places. The quartzite blocks, I realized, might have served as more than just geological features. They could have been intentional barriers, seals placed over sites of spiritual significance. I tried calling the mining company's headquarters that night, but reached only an answering service. The woman who took my message sounded harried, mentioning something about equipment malfunctions at the site and workers refusing to return for their shifts. Sleep came fitfully. I kept hearing sounds outside my cabin. Footsteps on gravel, soft knocking that might have been tree branches against the walls, and once, distinctly, my ex-wife's voice calling my name from the front porch. Sarah had moved to Rio 2 years ago after our divorce. She had no reason to be in these mountains, no way to know where I lived now. I stayed inside, though every instinct screamed at me to go to the door. Wednesday brought new reports. More circles had appeared, larger ones now, and the voices were becoming more frequent. People described family members, friends, even pets calling to them from the forest. The voices always seemed to come from just beyond sight, always asked for help with something urgent. Eduardo Santos called around 10 a.m. His voice was strained, exhausted. He'd spent the night watching his property from the kitchen window. 3 times he'd seen his father walking the perimeter of the largest circle, hands clasped behind his back in the old man's characteristic pose. Each time, Eduardo had started for the door before catching himself. But the 4th time, he'd seen something that made him doubt his own perception. The figure walking the circle had been his father, but the proportions were wrong. The arms too long, the way it moved too fluid, and when it turned in profile, the face had possessed too many angles, shadows where features should have been. I drove back to the mine site, hoping to speak directly with the company supervisor. The access road was empty, equipment sitting idle. Carlos was nowhere to be found, though his pickup truck remained parked near the ravine entrance. The painted figures seemed different in the midday light, more detailed somehow, as if exposure to air were bringing out previously hidden layers of pigment. I spent an hour photographing them systematically, though the camera continued to behave strangely. In several shots, the humanoid figures appeared to have additional details, facial features, hand positions, that I couldn't see with the naked eye. It was while reviewing the camera's display that I noticed the sound had stopped. The mechanical humming I'd grown accustomed to over the past few days, generators, compressors, The distant rumble of trucks had ceased entirely. The silence felt profound, almost crushing. Even the usual forest sounds seemed muted. I was preparing to leave when I heard the first voice, my mother calling my name from somewhere deeper in the ravine. Her voice carried the exact inflection she'd used when I was a child, summoning me for dinner or to help with chores. It triggered such a powerful sense memory that I found myself walking toward the sound before conscious thought could intervene. The ravine extended further back than I'd realized, narrowing into passages barely wide enough for the mining equipment. The voice called again, more urgent now, explaining that she'd fallen and needed help getting up. I forced myself to stop walking. My mother had died when I was 15, victim of a bus accident in downtown Belo Horizonte. There was no way she could be in this ravine, no logical explanation for what I was hearing. But the voice was so perfectly hers, worried but trying not to alarm me, slightly out of breath from the pain she was experiencing. It was accompanied by small sounds that made the scenario vivid. The scrape of gravel, a soft gasp, the rustle of fabric against stone. I backed away slowly, fighting every impulse to respond, to help, to go to her. The drive back to town was surreal. Twice I caught glimpses of figures standing among the trees that lined the road. Tall, angular shapes that might have been people if you didn't look too closely. They stood perfectly still, watching the truck pass, and when I checked the rearview mirror, they were gone. I spent Wednesday evening on the phone with mining company executives, trying to explain the situation without sounding completely insane. The geological significance of the cave paintings, I argued, required immediate suspension of the operation pending archaeological review. The company's legal representative listened politely, but made no commitments. They would send someone to assess the situation within the week. Thursday morning brought the call I'd been dreading. Maria Santos was nearly hysterical. The circles in her yard had tripled in size overnight, and worse, she'd seen figures emerging from them during the pre-dawn hours. Tall shapes that moved with unnatural fluidity, approaching the house before retreating when lights came on. Eduardo had tried to photograph them with his phone, but the camera had malfunctioned, producing only images of empty yards scattered with normal grass. I arrived at the Santos property to find the family barricaded inside, curtains drawn, refusing to come out until full daylight. The circles had indeed expanded, their geometric precision somehow more unsettling at this larger scale. The plants within them seemed more robust, more definitively wrong for the local ecosystem. But it was the footprints that made my hands shake as I documented them. Barefoot impressions circled each moss formation, but the prints were elongated, with too many toe marks and patterns that suggested bark-like texture in the skin. They approached the house from multiple angles before retreating toward the forest edge. I followed the tracks into the woods, though every rational part of my mind screamed against it. The trail led uphill, winding between quartzite outcroppings toward the ridgeline. The forest felt different here, too quiet, too still, with an underlying sense of presence that made my skin crawl. The tracks ended at a massive cecropia tree whose trunk bore patterns I'd never seen before. Spiraling grooves carved deep into the bark, forming designs that echoed the cave paintings. As I circled the tree, photographing the markings, I became aware of a sound like whispered conversation coming from within the trunk itself. I pressed my ear to the bark and heard them clearly, multiple voices speaking in overlapping patterns, discussing plans I couldn't quite make out. The conversations seemed urgent, organizational, as if preparations were being made for something significant. One voice sounded like my grandfather, dead these 10 years. Another like my former partner Miguel, though Miguel lived in Brasilia now and had no business being in these mountains. I stumbled backward, heart hammering, and that's when I saw them. Figures standing among the trees, partially hidden by shadows and trunk placement. At first glance they looked human. Adult height, bipedal posture, familiar silhouettes. But the longer I stared, the more the details wrong-footed my perception. Arms that branched at impossible angles. Faces that seemed to be composed of overlapping bark patterns. Postures that suggested humanity while defying human anatomy. They stood perfectly still, watching me with what might have been curious interest. I ran. The remaining daylight hours passed in a haze of phone calls and research. I contacted every authority I could think of: archaeological societies, indigenous rights groups, environmental protection agencies. Most responses were politely dismissive. A few promised to look into the matter eventually. The mining company's representative finally returned my calls. They were suspending operations temporarily, she said, due to equipment failures and worker safety concerns. Several employees had reported harassment by local residents, voices calling to them from the forest, unauthorized persons on the property after hours. But they would not commit to returning the quartzite blocks. The stone had already been processed and distributed to construction sites. Retrieval would be logistically complex and financially prohibitive. That evening, alone in my cabin, I tried to make sense of what I'd experienced. The logical explanations seemed insufficient. Mass hallucination, psychological contagion, some kind of gas leak from the mining operation affecting local brain chemistry. But the physical evidence remained. The photographs, however, blurred. The plant samples, though my equipment couldn't identify their species. The footprints, documented and measured. I was reviewing the cave painting photographs on my laptop when the screen began to behave strangely. The images seemed to shift between frames, figures moving in ways that digital files shouldn't allow. In one shot, the painted humanoids appeared to be climbing out of the rock face itself, reaching toward the camera with elongated arms. I closed the laptop and went to bed, though sleep seemed impossible. The voices started around midnight. Sarah's voice, soft and concerned, explaining that she'd driven all the way from Rio to see me, that she was lost on the forest roads and needed directions to the cabin. The sound came from directly outside my bedroom window, accompanied by the soft scuff of footsteps on gravel. Then Miguel's voice, laughing about some shared memory, asking me to come outside and help him with something he'd found in the woods. Something important, something I needed to see. My grandfather's voice, speaking in the patient tones he'd used when teaching me to fish, inviting me to join him by the old quarry pond. Just like when I was small, he said. Just the two of us. I lay rigid beneath my blankets, hands clenched into fists, forcing myself not to respond. The voices continued for hours, cycling through everyone I'd ever cared about. They all needed help. They were all just outside, waiting for me to open the door. As dawn approached, the voices faded, replaced by sounds I couldn't identify. Rustling that might have been wind through leaves, or might have been many bodies moving through underbrush. Soft percussion against the cabin's exterior walls that could have been rain, or fingers tapping against wood. When full daylight arrived, I found the footprints. They circled the cabin completely, dozens of overlapping tracks in the soft earth around my foundation. The same elongated, bark-textured impressions I documented at the Santos property. They approached every window, every door, some ending mere inches from the glass. But strangest of all were the patterns pressed into the soil, spiraling designs that matched the cave paintings, created by something dragging through the dirt in careful, deliberate motions. I called the mining company's emergency line and demanded immediate removal of all extracted quartzite. Return it to the original site, I insisted. Reassemble the barrier, seal whatever had been opened. The representative was professionally apologetic but firm. The processed stone could not be returned to its original state, even if they were willing to bear the cost, which they were not. The quartzite had been cut and shaped for specific construction applications. It no longer existed as the blocks that had been extracted. The conversation continued for 20 minutes, my voice becoming increasingly strained as I tried to explain the urgency without sounding completely deranged. She listened patiently, promised to forward my concerns to the appropriate departments, and assured me that all environmental regulations had been followed to the letter. After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen, staring at the footprint photographs on my camera, wondering if I was losing my mind. The question feels more urgent now, 3 days later, as I write this account. The circles have appeared throughout the region, and the voices call every night with increasing persistence. People are staying indoors after dark, but I don't think that will help much longer. Yesterday, Eduardo Santos called to report that the bark patterns from the footprints were appearing on his skin, subtle at first, like shadows, but becoming more pronounced each day. He'd tried scrubbing them off, but they seemed to emerge from beneath the surface, like some kind of subcutaneous growth. Maria had noticed similar changes in her own reflection, though she couldn't be certain they weren't just tricks of light and shadow. I haven't told them about my own hands. The pattern started as faint discoloration along my palms and fingertips, easily dismissed as staining from handling soil samples or artifact residue. But they're spreading now, becoming more defined, creating intricate designs that hurt to look at directly. Sometimes I catch myself walking toward the forest without remembering the decision to leave the cabin. I find myself standing at the tree line, listening to voices that sound like everyone I've ever loved, all of them asking me to come deeper into the woods, to help them with something urgent just out of sight. The cave paintings, when I return to study them, seem to tell a different story each time. The figures that once appeared to be emerging from trees now look like they might be returning to them. The human forms in the images seem less distinct, more plant-like, as if the barrier between categories were dissolving. I understand now that the quartzite blocks weren't just geological features. They were a containment system, designed by people who understood something we've forgotten. The spirits in the stories weren't malevolent exactly, just following their nature, seeking to expand, to merge, to continue existing in the only way they could. But the world has changed since those barriers were first put in place. We've forgotten the agreements, lost the knowledge of how to maintain the balance, and now that the seals are broken, something ancient is adapting to modern circumstances. The mining company was right about one thing. The extracted quartzite can't be returned to its original form. The barriers can't be reconstructed. But I think something else is being constructed instead. The bark patterns on my skin have deepened overnight, and when I speak, my voice sometimes carries harmonics that don't sound entirely human. The forest calls more clearly now, and the effort required to resist the summons grows weaker each day. I find myself wondering what it would be like to stop resisting, to walk into the woods and discover what lies beyond the tree line, what the voices are really trying to show me. The question of whether any of this is real seems less important each morning. My perception might be compromised, my grip on reality gradually loosening, but the physical changes are undeniable. The patterns, the voices, the growing sense that I'm becoming something other than what I was. Even if it's all in my mind, something fundamental has shifted, and I suspect that difference, real or imagined, is becoming permanent. Tomorrow, I think I'll stop fighting the voices. After all, they only want to help. Story 11. The first time I saw the silhouettes, I convinced myself it was nothing more than fatigue. After 18 years designing marketing materials for tourism boards across the Southwest, my eyes had grown accustomed to long nights hunched over vintage brochures, cataloging their faded promises of adventure. But that Tuesday evening in October, as I filed away a peculiar pamphlet from something called Bosque de Meia-Noite, the reflection in my dormant television screen shifted in ways that made my breath catch. 3 figures stood behind my chair, their forms wavering like heat mirages against the black screen. They whispered in a language that felt familiar, yet incomprehensible, words that seemed to bypass my ears and settle directly into the base of my skull. I spun around to find nothing but empty space and the gentle hum of my refrigerator 2 rooms away. The brochure lay open on my desk, its cover displaying an ornate iron gate adorned with intertwining vines and crescent moons. Midnight Grove Amusement Park, read the elegant script beneath, where dreams take root. The paper felt unusually thick between my fingers, almost warm, and bore no publication date or location. I'd purchased it from an estate sale in Tucson, part of a box lot that included dozens of other tourism ephemera from the 1960s and 70s. I closed the pamphlet and slid it into my filing cabinet under M for miscellaneous. The whispering stopped immediately. Sleep came fitfully that night. I found myself checking the living room repeatedly, drawn by a persistent feeling that someone stood just beyond my peripheral vision. Each time I looked, the television screen reflected only my own haggard face and the familiar contours of my apartment. but the sensation of being observed clung to me like smoke, following me from room to room until dawn finally provided relief. 3 days passed before I opened the filing cabinet again. I'd been working on a project for a Nevada tourism board when I remembered the unusual design elements of the Midnight Grove brochure. Perhaps I could adapt some of its aesthetic choices, the way moonlight seemed to actually emanate from the printed page, or how the shadows between the trees suggested movement even in static images. The moment I lifted the pamphlet from its folder, the whispers returned. This time I forced myself to remain still, to listen. The voices seemed to originate from different directions simultaneously, creating an unsettling surround sound effect that made my skin crawl. I could almost make out individual words. Something about waiting, about collection, about completion. The television screen remained dark, but I could feel those 3 silhouettes reforming behind me, their presence heavy as storm clouds. I slammed the brochure shut and shoved it back into the filing cabinet, but the whispers continued for another full minute before fading to silence. That weekend, I decided the pamphlet had to go. Whatever preservation instincts had driven me to collect these materials for nearly 2 decades, they weren't worth the sleep I'd been losing. I pulled the brochure from its file and fed it directly into my paper shredder, watching the elegant design disappear into ribbons of multicolored confetti. The relief was immediate and profound. I slept deeply for the first time in days, and the oppressive feeling that had been building in my apartment seemed to dissipate like morning fog. For 3 weeks, I almost forgot about Midnight Grove entirely. Then I received a commission from a client in Santa Fe to research historical amusement parks of the Southwest for a heritage tourism campaign. The work required extensive online research, diving deep into archives and digitized collections of vintage advertising materials. I was scrolling through a database of 1970s tourism brochures when I saw it again. The Iron Gate, the intertwining vines, the crescent moons. My cursor froze over the thumbnail image as that familiar whisper began in the back of my mind, not from external speakers this time, but as if the sound originated from inside my own skull. I could feel the temperature in my office dropping degree by degree, my breath beginning to mist despite the October heat outside. I slammed the laptop shut, but the damage was done. The whispers grew louder, multiplying into a chorus that seemed to fill every corner of my apartment. When I finally worked up the courage to check the television screen in my living room, all 3 silhouettes were there, clearer than ever before. They stood in perfect formation, hands reaching toward me across the impossible distance between reflection and reality. This pattern repeated itself with horrifying consistency over the following months. Every time I encountered the Midnight Grove logo in online databases, auction listings, even once in a documentary about defunct amusement parks, the whispers would return with renewed intensity. I began avoiding certain websites, steering clear of vintage tourism forums where the image might surface unexpectedly. I installed browser filters and ad blockers, anything to prevent accidental exposure, but the presence grew stronger despite my efforts. I started noticing the silhouettes, even when I wasn't looking at screens, reflected in my bathroom mirror, in the glass of picture frames, in the surface of my coffee when the light hit it just right. They never appeared in direct sight, only in reflections, always standing in that same triangular formation, always reaching. The whispers began following me outside my apartment. I'd catch fragments while walking past storefront windows, see shadow movements in car mirrors during my commute. My concentration at work deteriorated as I found myself constantly checking reflective surfaces, always expecting to see those 3 familiar figures lurking just beyond the boundary of the real world. By February, I'd convinced myself that I was experiencing some form of delayed stress reaction. 18 years of intensive visual work had probably damaged my perception in ways I didn't fully understand. Eye strain, perhaps, or even early signs of a neurological condition. I scheduled appointments with my doctor, an ophthalmologist, even a neurologist who ran a battery of tests that all came back normal. Sometimes the brain creates patterns where none exist, the neurologist explained during my follow-up appointment, especially in professions that require intensive visual processing. I'd recommend reducing screen time and perhaps consulting with a therapist about stress management techniques. I followed his advice religiously. I cut my work hours, spent more time outdoors, even tried meditation classes at a local community center. For a few weeks, the whispers seemed to fade, the silhouettes appearing less frequently and with diminished clarity. Then I found the forum post. It was buried deep in a thread about lost amusement parks of the American Southwest, posted by someone with the username MidnightCollector47. The message was brief but precise. Anyone else have experiences with Bosque de Medianoite materials? The collection calls to be completed. The gate waits for those who understand. My hands trembled as I typed a response, asking for more details. The reply came within hours. Physical location confirmed. Coordinates attached. The symbol is inverted at the source. Mirror image of what we've seen. It expects us to return what we've taken. The coordinates led to a remote area in the Gila National Forest of New Mexico, roughly 50 miles northeast of Silver City. Satellite imagery showed nothing but dense woodland and rocky terrain, but topographical maps from the 1960s indicated the presence of a small resort or recreational facility in that exact location. I spent 3 days researching the area, cross-referencing property records and mining historical documents. Midnight Grove had existed briefly between 1962 and 1974. Local newspaper archives mentioned it sporadically, a themed entertainment venue that had never quite found its audience, eventually closing due to financial difficulties and what one article cryptically referred to as ongoing operational challenges. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that visiting the actual location might provide answers, or at least some form of closure. The whispers had been growing more persistent, the silhouettes appearing even in reflections where logic insisted they shouldn't exist, in the curved surface of spoons, in the chrome of my car's bumper, even in the black screen of my phone when the light caught it at certain angles. I needed this to end. The drive to New Mexico took most of a Saturday, winding through increasingly remote mountain roads until GPS service became spotty and road signs disappeared entirely. The coordinates led me to what appeared to be an abandoned Forest Service road, barely wide enough for my sedan and carpeted with years of fallen pine needles. I parked where the road became impassable and continued on foot, following a trail that seemed almost deliberately hidden among the trees. The forest was unusually quiet. No bird songs, no insect chatter, just the whisper of wind through pine branches and the crunch of my footsteps on ancient leaf litter. After nearly an hour of hiking, I found it. The gate stood alone in a small clearing, its iron framework still intact despite decades of weathering. But something was wrong. The design I'd memorized from countless glimpses in the brochure had been completely inverted. Vines that had curved left now curved right. Crescent moons that had faced east now faced west. It was as if I were looking at the mirror image of what I'd seen in all those vintage photographs. As I approached, I noticed that the iron showed no signs of rust, despite its apparent age. The metal appeared almost polished, reflecting the late afternoon sunlight with unusual clarity. And there, etched into a small plaque near the base of the left gatepost, was a list of names. My name was at the bottom. Not a similar name, not a coincidence of spelling. My full name, middle initial included, in the same font and apparent age as the dozen names listed above it. Below my name, in fresh lettering that seemed to gleam wetly in the fading light, were the words, "Collection complete. Welcome home." The whispers started immediately, no longer confined to reflective surfaces but surrounding me from all directions. The three silhouettes materialized not as reflections but as actual shadows cast by nothing, moving across the ground toward my feet with deliberate purpose. The temperature dropped so rapidly that my breath formed visible clouds, and the taste of copper filled my mouth. I turned to run, but the trail behind me had vanished. Where I'd emerged from the forest, solid wall of trees now stood, their trunks grown so close together that not even mice could squeeze between them. I spun in a full circle, searching for any gap in the vegetation, but found only an impenetrable barrier of pine and oak that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. The gate creaked open. Beyond it lay not the ruins of an abandoned amusement park, but a perfect recreation of my own apartment. I could see my desk through the entrance, my filing cabinets, even my television screen. which now displayed not my reflection, but the image of empty space where I should have been standing. The whispers resolved into words at last, spoken in perfect unison by voices I somehow recognized as my own. The collection was never meant to be kept. It was meant to be returned. We've been waiting for you to understand. I took a step toward the gate, then another. Each footfall seemed to echo not just in the present moment, but across decades, as if I were walking in the footsteps of all those other names on the plaque. The silhouettes moved alongside me now, no longer threatening but welcoming, their forms beginning to solidify into familiar shapes. As I crossed the threshold, I caught my reflection in the polished surface of the gate itself. But the person looking back wasn't quite me. It was me as I appeared in all those vintage photographs I'd been collecting, dressed in clothing from decades before my birth, standing in locations I'd never visited. The gate closed behind me with a sound like distant thunder, and I found myself standing in my apartment once again. But everything was slightly wrong. Colors too vivid, shadows too deep, reflections that moved independently of their sources. The filing cabinet stood open, every folder perfectly organized, every brochure in its proper place, including a fresh copy of the Midnight Grove pamphlet. I opened it with hands that felt both familiar and foreign, studying the elegant design that had started this entire journey. But now I could see additional details that had never been there before. Tiny figures walking among the trees, barely visible unless you knew exactly where to look. One of them, standing near the gate in the illustration, bore my face. The whispers have stopped, but I understand now that they were never whispers at all. They were instructions, guidance, the voices of everyone who had come before me trying to explain what I was too frightened to comprehend. The collection was never about preserving the past. It was about completing something that had begun decades ago, something that required specific people in specific places at specific times. I am still in my apartment, but I am also still at the gate. I can see both realities simultaneously now, existing in parallel spaces that occupy the same coordinates but different dimensions of possibility. Sometimes tourists drive past the clearing where the gate stands, but they see only empty forest. Sometimes colleagues call my office phone, but they reach only voicemail that plays messages I don't remember recording. The brochure sits open on my desk, and new names have begun appearing on that list. Names of people who will find their way to estate sales and auction houses, who will be drawn to vintage tourism materials, who will feel compelled to collect pieces of a puzzle they don't yet understand they're assembling. I've started leaving breadcrumbs for them, posting in forums, uploading images to databases, ensuring that the Midnight Grove logo appears in all the right places at all the right times. The collection must be completed, one piece at a time, one collector at a time. And sometimes, late at night, I can see them in my television screen. Not as silhouettes now, but as full figures standing in rooms I recognize from their own research, their own desperate attempts to understand what's happening to them. They're reaching toward their own reflections just as I once did, trying to touch something that exists just beyond their fingertips. Soon, they'll understand. Soon, they'll find the coordinates. Soon, they'll make the journey to complete what they began the moment they decided to preserve something that was never meant to be kept. The gate is always open for collectors who understand their purpose. The gate is always waiting. Story 12. The sound starts at exactly 3:33 a.m., always. It begins as a whisper, water finding its way through pipes that shouldn't be carrying anything at this hour. A gentle drip, drip, drip that pulls me from whatever restless sleep I've managed to capture in my ground floor apartment in Curitiba. The building is old, probably from the 70s, with that particular Brazilian architecture that prioritizes function over form. Concrete walls thick enough to muffle the neighbor's television, but apparently not thick enough to silence whatever moves through the plumbing after midnight. I've been living here for 8 months now, ever since the consulting firm transferred me from São Paulo. The rent was reasonable, the location convenient for my IT work, and the landlord seemed eager to fill the unit. Too eager, perhaps. Red flags I should have noticed, but didn't, because I was tired of hotel living and needed a place to call home. The first few nights, I blamed the building's age. Old pipes settle, expand, contract. Water finds its way through microscopic cracks, especially during Curitiba's humid summer months. I told myself these things while lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to that rhythmic dripping that seemed to echo from somewhere deep within the walls. But pipes don't explain the cold that creeps under my bedroom door precisely 17 minutes after the dripping begins. A chill that has nothing to do with the building's concrete construction or the early morning hours. It's a cold that feels purposeful, searching, as if something is testing the air for my scent. I started keeping a notebook by my bedside, documenting the occurrences with the methodical precision my profession demands. Day 3, 3:33 a.m. Dripping begins in bathroom wall. 3:50 a.m. Temperature drops approximately 8-10 degrees Fahrenheit. 4:02 a.m. Sound stops abruptly. Day 4, same pattern. Day 5, same pattern. But this time I notice the bathroom mirror fogging slightly around the edges, as if something warm is breathing against the glass from behind. The reflection appears on night 7. I'm standing at the bathroom sink, splashing cold water on my face in a futile attempt to shock myself back to sleep, when I see it in the peripheral vision of the mirror, a black shape, low to the ground, moving with an unnatural gait. When I turn to look directly, nothing. When I return my gaze to the mirror, there it is again. A black cat, but wrong somehow. Its hind legs appear to bend backward at impossible angles, as if they've been broken and healed incorrectly, or as if the creature is walking on joints that don't belong to any earthly anatomy. The reflection lasts only seconds before vanishing, leaving me staring at my own wide-eyed face in the glass. My heart pounds against my ribs with such force I can hear it over the endless dripping. I reach for my phone to document this latest development, but my hands shake too violently to type coherently. That's when I remember the verses my grandmother used to recite during the electrical storms that would sweep across our family's farm in Minas Gerais. Ayat al-Kursi, she called it, though I never understood why a Catholic woman would turn to Islamic prayers during moments of fear. The Arabic words flow from some buried corner of my memory, rusty but intact. Allahu la ilaha illa huwa al-hayyu al-qayyum. The dripping stops. Not gradually, not with the natural conclusion of water finding its level, but instantly. Complete silence floods the apartment, so absolute I can hear my own blood circulation. For perhaps 30 seconds, I allow myself to believe I've found the solution, that my grandmother's old protective words have banished whatever haunts this place. Then the kitchen faucet begins to drip. The sound is identical, that same rhythmic tempo, the same metallic echo. But now it's moved 20 feet away, to the opposite end of the apartment. I walk toward the kitchen on unsteady legs, bare feet silent against the cold tile floor. The faucet handle is shut tight, but water continues to fall from the spout in perfect intervals, each drop creating concentric ripples in the stainless steel sink. I twist the handle tighter, though it's already closed. The dripping continues. I check the pipes beneath the sink, running my hands along every joint and connection I can reach. Everything is dry, yet the sound persists with metronomic precision. By morning, exhaustion has replaced fear. I make coffee and try to rationalize the night's events while reviewing my work emails. Stress-induced hallucinations aren't uncommon in my field. 60-hour weeks, constant client demands, the pressure of maintaining systems that entire businesses depend on. It takes a toll. The mind creates patterns where none exist, finds threats in harmless coincidences. But the apartment's cold spots remain throughout the day. I map them with a digital thermometer, finding zones that register consistently 15 degrees cooler than the surrounding areas. They follow the path of the building's main water line, from the bathroom, through the bedroom wall, into the kitchen, as if something cold is moving through the pipes even when no water flows. I begin researching the building's history during my lunch breaks, diving into municipal records and property databases with the same systematic approach I use for debugging network issues. The building has had 14 different owners since construction, an unusually high turnover rate for Brazilian real estate. Most apartments in the building have similar histories: short tenancies, frequent changes, rental prices that seem to drop every few years. My unit, 1A, has the most detailed record. The previous tenant lasted only 6 weeks before breaking his lease. Before him, a young couple stayed 3 months. Before them, an elderly woman made it 8 months before relocating to live with family in Porto Alegre. The pattern extends back to the building's construction, with only 2 tenants ever staying longer than a year. The breakthrough comes when I contact Mrs. Oliveira, the elderly woman who lived here before the couple. She agrees to meet me at a cafe downtown. Her voice cautious but willing when I explain I'm having issues with the apartment. She's smaller than I expected, with silver hair pulled into a careful bun, and hands that flutter like nervous birds when she speaks. Her eyes, though, sharp and intelligent, missing nothing. "You hear them at night," she says before I've finished explaining my situation. It's not a question. I nod, suddenly grateful not to be the only one who knows. Mrs. Oliveira stirs her coffee with deliberate slowness, as if choosing her words with equal care. The couple before me, they tried to tell people. The boy who lived there before them too. But who believes such stories? She explains that she began researching the building's history after her first week of sleepless nights. Unlike me, she had connections, friends who worked in the city planning office, relatives who remembered the neighborhood's earlier days. What she discovered made her understand why previous tenants rarely discussed their reasons for leaving. Before the building there was a house, she tells me. An old woman lived there with too many cats, dozens of them. The neighbors complained about the smell, but she never listened. When she died, they found... She pauses, her fingers tightening around her coffee cup. They found she had been performing certain rituals, feeding the cats special foods, making offerings to entities that decent people don't name. My coffee grows cold as she continues. The city condemned the house after the woman's death, but not before someone had to dispose of the cats. Dozens of them, in various states of health and malnutrition. The municipal workers reportedly found evidence of ritual spaces in the basement, altars constructed around the house's main drainage pipes. The new owners built over everything, Mrs. Oliveira explains. They thought they could bury the past under concrete and steel, but some things don't stay buried. I ask her about the offerings, about what might still be moving through the building's water system. Her hands stop fluttering, and she fixes me with a stare that feels uncomfortably penetrating. "You've seen it, haven't you? In the mirror?" When I describe the cat with backward-bending legs, she nods grimly. She called it her guardian. Fed it things that cats shouldn't eat, spoke to it in languages that shouldn't be spoken. When she died, it didn't die with her. Mrs. Oliveira left because she couldn't bring herself to do what needed to be done. The couple after her tried sage smudging and hired a Catholic priest to bless the apartment. The young man before them attempted to have the pipes professionally cleaned. None of these solutions addressed the real problem. "The pipes need to be purified," she tells me, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not just cleaned, but spiritually cleansed. Every length of piping that carries water through that building. The creature moves through the water system like a highway, but it's getting stronger. Learning. Soon it won't need the pipes at all." I spend the next 3 days researching purification rituals, consulting Islamic scholars online about proper cleansing procedures for contaminated spaces. The process requires specific materials, blessed salt, pure water, prayers recited in precise sequences, and must be performed during particular lunar phases. Most importantly, it must be done completely. Miss a single section of pipe, leave one drainage point uncleansed, and the effort becomes worthless. The supply runs alone cost me nearly a month's salary. Rock salt blessed by an imam in Sao Paulo, spring water from specific mountain sources, oils that must be mixed according to formulas that have been passed down through generations. I feel like a fraud performing religious rituals I barely understand, but desperation has replaced skepticism. The work begins on a Tuesday night, just after the new moon. I start in the bathroom, removing the access panel behind the toilet to reach the main water line. The pipes are old galvanized steel, green with corrosion and wear. I coat my hands with the blessed oil and begin to work, reciting the prayers I've memorized phonetically, hoping pronunciation matters less than intention. The apartment grows colder as I work. Not the gradual chill of night air, but an aggressive cold that makes my breath visible in sharp puffs. By the time I reach the kitchen pipes, the temperature has dropped enough that condensation forms on every metal surface. My hands shake, whether from cold or fear, I can't determine. That's when I hear it moving. Not dripping water, but something much larger traveling through pipes that should barely accommodate liquid flow. A wet sliding sound, like a snake made of oil and shadows. It's in the wall behind the stove, moving toward the main junction where the building's water lines converge. I work faster, applying the oil to every accessible pipe section, speaking the Arabic words until my voice goes hoarse. The sliding sound grows louder, more agitated, as if whatever lives in the pipes is being driven toward some inevitable confrontation. At 3:33 a.m. exactly, the apartment fills with the sound of rushing water. Every faucet, every drain, every toilet begins to flow simultaneously. Water pours from fixtures I haven't turned on, bubbles up from floor drains I didn't know existed. But the water isn't clear. It carries dark particles, organic matter that should have been filtered out decades ago. The smell hits me like a physical blow. Decay, ritual herbs, something that might once have been food but has rotted into unrecognizable slime. Through the chaos of flooding water, I see the reflection again. Not in the bathroom mirror this time, but in the standing water that now covers the kitchen floor. The black cat is larger now, more distinct, its impossible legs carrying it in circles just beneath the surface. When it looks up at me through the watery barrier, its eyes hold an intelligence that no animal should possess. I continue the purification process even as water soaks through my clothes and the apartment fills with the stench of whatever has been living in the pipes. The ritual demands completion, regardless of circumstances. Each prayer spoken, each section of pipe treated, weakens the barrier between this thing and our world. But weakening barriers works both ways. As dawn breaks and the flooding finally stops, I stand ankle-deep in water that reflects nothing but ceiling lights. The cat is gone. From the water, from the mirrors, from the peripheral spaces where it used to lurk. The dripping has stopped completely. The cold spots have vanished. The apartment feels normal for the first time since I moved in. I should feel victorious. The ritual worked exactly as Mrs. Oliveira and the online scholars promised it would. The creature has been banished, the pipes purified, the apartment finally habitable. Instead, I feel watched. Not by something in the mirrors or pipes, but by something much closer. Something that learned to move beyond reflections during the months it spent observing me. Something that discovered, through our nightly encounters, that the boundary between the spiritual realm and physical reality is thinner than most people realize. The water damage is extensive but manageable. I file insurance claims and hire restoration specialists, all the while maintaining the facade of a normal tenant dealing with normal plumbing problems. The workers replace damaged flooring and repaint water-stained walls, never knowing they're erasing evidence of successful supernatural intervention. But late at night, when the apartment is quiet and the new pipes carry only the building's legitimate water flow, I sometimes catch glimpses of black fur in my peripheral vision. Not in mirrors or reflective surfaces, but in the spaces around furniture, the corners where shadows naturally gather. I tell myself it's residual anxiety, the mind's refusal to immediately adjust to solved problems. Stress-induced hallucinations that will fade as my sleep schedule returns to normal. The rational explanations I relied on before beginning this ordeal. Except now I know the difference between rational explanations and truth. The creature is gone from the pipes. The building's water system flows clear and cold, carrying nothing more dangerous than municipal fluoride and trace minerals. The ritual worked perfectly, exactly as promised. But spiritual purification is a two-way process. While I was cleansing the creature from its watery realm, it was learning to exist in mine. Every night we shared, every moment I spent in its presence, created a connection that transcends simple physical barriers. I succeeded in driving it from the drainage system. I just never considered where else it might choose to live. The notebook by my bedside remains empty now. No more 3:33 a.m. disturbances to document. No more temperature fluctuations to measure. The apartment stays comfortable throughout the night, and I sleep peacefully until morning. But sometimes, when I'm working late at my computer or preparing dinner in the kitchen, I feel something watching me with familiar intelligence. Something that no longer needs mirrors or water to manifest its presence. Something that has learned, through our extended acquaintance, to exist in the spaces between what's real and what's possible. Mrs. Oliveira was right about the purification process. She just neglected to mention that some problems, once solved, create entirely new ones. The creature is gone from the building's pipes. It lives somewhere much closer now,